The Calloways are not taken from one diary. They are built from many, because the story they carry was carried by thousands. Look at the wagon before anyone has loaded it. The canvas is white, clean white, the white of something that has not been asked to do anything yet. The frame is tight. The wheels have not found a single rut. There is no smell to it, except raw timber and new cloth. This is the wagon on the last day of April, 1846, sitting in a yard in Boone County, Missouri. By morning, it will be moving west. Tonight, look at the house. Margaret Calloway stands in the doorway of the room where her children sleep. Clara is 6 years old. She is on her side, with both hands tucked under her cheek, holding a cloth doll against her chest. The doll has a blue dress, bright blue, the blue of something new. Margaret sewed it 3 winters ago from a scrap of fabric left over from her own apron. Tom is 11. He is on his back with his eyes open, looking at the ceiling, the way a person looks at something they are trying to memorize. He does not know he is doing this. He is doing it. The room is almost empty. The furniture went into the wagon 2 days ago. What remains are the beds, the children in them, and the shapes on the walls where pictures used to hang, pale rectangles against the faded plaster, the outlines of things already gone. The fire in the hearth is still burning. Margaret has let it burn down low, but she has not put it out. The room is warm enough without it. They will be gone before dawn, and there is no reason to keep a fire going in a house you are leaving. She stands in the doorway watching the coals, and the coals watch nothing back. The front door opens and closes. James has gone out to check the wagon again. This is the 3rd time tonight. Margaret does not call after him. She understands the checking, the need to put your hands on a thing and confirm it is still there and still right when everything else has already been surrendered. Clara shifts in her sleep and pulls the doll closer. Tom does not move. Margaret stands in the doorway a little longer than she needs to. Then she goes downstairs. Outside, James is at the wagon with one hand on the sideboards and his head slightly bowed, not praying, not calculating, resting against the fact of a thing that has already been decided. The yard is dark except for moonlight. The 2 oxen stand in the pen at the side of the house, close together the way animals stand when something is about to change. Margaret comes to stand beside him. They do not speak. There is nothing left to say that has not already been said or packed into barrels or tied down in the wagon bed. James puts his hand over hers on the sideboards. They stand like that for a moment. In the morning the fire will go out on its own. The coals will gray and cool, and the house will become the temperature of the April air around it. Whoever comes next will build their own fire in that hearth, and it will be their fire and not the Calloways' fire anymore. But that is morning. Tonight the fire is still burning. The children are still sleeping. The wagon stands in the yard, white and waiting. And everything that is about to happen has not happened yet. James Calloway did not decide to go to Oregon the way a man decides to take a journey. He decided the way a man decides to stop doing something that is no longer working. He had farmed the same 40 acres in Boone County for 11 years. He knew every corner of it, where the soil went heavy with clay in wet springs and where it drained fast enough to plant early, which fence line the deer came through, which field flooded 2 years out of 3. He had made the land work. Some years better, some years harder. He had always made it work. The problem was not the land. The problem was Tom, not Tom himself. Tom at 18, 7 years from now, looking for ground of his own. Land in Missouri was selling for 10, 12, sometimes $15 an acre by the mid-1840s. A man with 2 children and a mortgaged farm ran that number forward and kept arriving at the same place. Not enough. Not in time. The valley in the west that people were writing letters about had land that was still available, still open, still possible, if you went before someone else did. James had read 2 guidebooks, and a dozen letters passed hand to hand through the county. He had sat at the table after supper on enough winter nights that the wood was worn in a circle where his coffee cup rested. He was not a man who moved toward things quickly. He was a man who moved toward things when he had run out of reasons not to. Oregon was not guaranteed in 1846. There was no law promising a man land for going. The Donation Land Claim Act would not come until 1850, 4 years away. And James did not know it was coming. What was traveling east? Traveling in letters and in the mouths of men who had been there or knew someone who had, was something older than law. It was the idea of land that was still there to be had, at the end of a road that most men had not yet walked. The promise had gone west before the law did. James made his decision before the law caught up. He was not alone in this. In the spring of 1846, somewhere around 1,000 people left the Missouri River towns heading for Oregon. Not all of them were farmers, watching land prices climb. Some were men whose lungs had been breaking down in the Mississippi bottomlands and who had heard that dry western air did what Missouri air would not. Some were families whose neighbors had gone the year before, and who found that a community with half its people missing was a colder and quieter place than the one they had agreed to settle in. Some were men running from debts or mistakes, or the particular weight of being known too well in too small a place for too many years. Oregon did not ask questions about where you came from. James Calloway was not running from anything. He was running toward something he could not fully see, which is its own kind of hard. He told Margaret in January. She had known it was coming. She had watched him reading those letters, watched the way he went quiet after talking to Robert Hastings, who had a brother in the Willamette Valley and had been saying for 2 years that the valley was everything the letters said it was. Margaret had watched all of it and had made her own decision before James said a word. She was going because her family was going. That was the whole calculation. She did not go because she believed in it the way James believed in it, with the stubbornness of a man who has committed his remaining chips to a direction. She went because the alternative was watching her husband and her children disappear down a road she had not taken. And that was not something she was capable of. What she said to James, after he told her, after the silence that followed, was this. She said, "Then we need to start making the list." He said, "I already have one." She said, "Not your list. Mine." She got the paper and sat down at the table and began. Her list was different from his. His was about miles and oxen and the season of departure and the route through South Pass. Hers was about the gap between what a family needed to survive 5 months on a trail and what they actually owned, measured in pounds and portions. and the number of days a barrel of salt pork lasted when you were feeding 5 people in all weather, doing hard physical work every day. The gap was real. They spent 3 months closing it. Daniel Calloway, James's older brother, had been watching from the farm 3 miles down the road. He was 38, with a wife named Ruth and 2 young children. He came to James in February with something that was less a proposition than a statement he was going to. His own wagon, his own oxen. And if James had a problem with that, then James could say so. James did not have a problem with it. What he did not yet understand, what he would not fully understand, until the Blue Mountains in September, was that he and Daniel read the same country with completely different instruments. James read it with patience. Daniel read it with a calendar. In April, standing in the yard in Boone County with 2 wagons loaded and the children asleep, that difference was invisible. It would not stay invisible. But in April, it was simply 2 brothers going west, which was what thousands of people were doing that spring, which was what the country seemed to be asking of its people in ways that no one had quite put into words yet. The word for it would come later. In April, it was just a direction, west. The wagon measured 4 feet wide and 10 feet long on the inside. Margaret knew this, the way she knew the dimensions of her kitchen. She had measured it herself in February with a length of string, standing in the cold, with her breath making small clouds, pulling the string taut from one wall to the other. 4 feet, 10 feet. She went back inside and stood in the middle of the kitchen and tried to see it. The kitchen was 14 feet across. She took 4 steps toward the east wall and stopped. Everything to her left. Everything to her right. The table and the 2 chairs and the shelf with the ceramic crocks and the window that looked out toward the barn. All of it was outside the wagon. Only what was directly in front of her fit. She stood there for a long time. Then she got the paper and started the list. A prairie schooner in the spring of 1846 could carry somewhere between 1,600 and 2,000 pounds before the load became dangerous. Dangerous meant top-heavy on a side slope. Dangerous meant a ford crossing where a leaning wagon became a rolling one. Dangerous meant oxen pulling weight that wore them to nothing before the mountains. And the mountains were not optional. 2,000 pounds sounds like enough until you start filling it. 200 pounds of flour for 5 months. 150 pounds of bacon, salted hard and packed in barrels. 60 pounds of coffee. Because coffee was the thing that got people moving at 4 in the morning when the ground was cold and the reasons for going felt very far away. Sugar, salt, rice, dried bean, dried fruit against scurvy, which the guidebooks mentioned in language calm enough to be frightening. Cornmeal, vinegar, that was before the tools. An axe, a spare axe head, a hammer and nails, rope, a great deal of rope, for river crossings and slope descents, a handsaw, chains for the oxen, spare yokes, wheel grease in a bucket that would hang under the wagon, because a dry axle seizes, and a seized axle on a mountain road ends things. A waterkach, a spare wheel iron, spare tongue, sparry axle, medicine, laudanum, castor oil, quinine for fever, bandage, turpentine. The guidebooks listed these things without explaining how to use most of them, which was its own kind of instruction. Bedding, the iron pot, the Dutch oven, the skillet, candles, a tinder box, clothing for 5 months in weather that would go from Missouri spring to mountain pass cold. The oxen needed feed for the early stretch before the grass came in. James went through his list and Margaret went through hers, and they spread everything they owned across the barn floor one Saturday in early March and looked at it. Then they started making decisions. The decisions were not dramatic. People imagine it as a series of tearful moments. A woman clutching something cherished while her husband explains why it cannot come. It was not like that. It was arithmetic. It was looking at two numbers that did not balance and finding ways to make them balance, one item at a time. Because sentiment was a thing they could not afford to pack. The rocking chair that had been Margaret's mother's left behind. The second set of dishes left behind. The writing desk James had built the first winter they were married, that sat in the corner of the bedroom, that Margaret had used every evening for 11 years, left behind. There was a moment with the writing desk. She ran her hand along the top of it, along the edge where the wood had worn smooth from her wrist, resting there through thousands of evenings of letters and accounts and the small written records of a life. Then she lifted her hand and turned away and did not look at it again. That was the moment. It lasted 4 seconds. Then she picked up the paper and drew a line through the desk and moved to the next item. The cedar chest was harder. Her mother had brought it from Ohio in the back of a wagon 20 years before, which gave it a particular kind of meaning that was also, when you thought about it clearly, a particular kind of irony. It was solid cedar, fragrant and tight-jointed, and it held the things Margaret had decided were most important: a Bible with her parents' names on the first page, letters from her sister in Indiana, a lock of hair from each child taken when they were infants, a piece of blue silk from the dress she had been married in. The chest weighed 60 pounds empty. James put it on the scale in the barn and read the number and wrote it down and said nothing. Margaret looked at the number. She took the Bible out of the chest. She took the letters. She took the hair and the silk. She wrapped them in oilcloth and tied the bundle with string and set it on the keep pile. She left the cedar chest in the barn. She left it in the middle of the floor where they had been sorting. And she did not ask the neighbors to take it. And she did not cover it with anything. She just left it there. By the time she thought about it again, they were past the Kansas River. Across the yard in Daniel's barn, Ruth was doing the same arithmetic with different results. Ruth was a more optimistic packer than Margaret, which meant that at Fort Laramie she would do this arithmetic a second time, in worse conditions, with less room to move. But in March, in Missouri, Ruth still believed that the things you loved most had a way of finding room. Margaret did not believe this. Margaret believed a thing either fit or it did not, and that believing otherwise was a way of postponing a pain that was coming regardless. She was right about this. On the first day of May, when both wagons rolled out of Boone County in the gray light before sunrise, everything in them had earned its place. Every pound was a decision, a thing weighed against something else and found more necessary. Most families on the Oregon Trail in 1846 left something behind they had not planned to leave, something packed carefully and loaded in good faith, and then lifted out in the last hours because the oxen were already straining and the road had not even started yet. The Calloways had left those things behind in March. Margaret had made sure of it. She had learned, in 11 years of running a household on a budget that did not always cooperate with the needs of the household, that it was better to grieve a thing in advance than to discover its absence when you were already in the middle of needing it. She had grieved everything already. She was ready. Get inside the wagon. The canvas is white, and light comes through it the way light comes through a closed eyelid. Diffuse and warm, and without direction, a glow that is everywhere at once. When the sun is high, the interior is bright enough to work in and hot enough to make you want out. When clouds move over, the light drops and the temperature drops with it, and the wagon becomes a different place. Cooler and more closed. More like the inside of something than the outside. Clara noticed the light on the first day. She was lying on her back on the folded bedding near the front, looking up at the canvas above her, watching the brightness shift when the wagon moved from open ground into a stand of trees and back out again. The trees made shadows on the canvas that moved across it like hands. She watched them for a long time. She said nothing. She just watched. The inside of the wagon was not a room. A room has walls that stop, and a floor that stays flat, and a ceiling that does not move when the wind blows. The wagon had none of these things. What it had was a shape. The bowed ribs of the frame pressing out against the canvas like the inside of a barrel. And within that shape, everything the Calloways owned was packed with the precision of a puzzle Margaret had spent 3 weeks solving. Along the bottom, the heaviest things. Flour barrels, bacon barrels, the tool chest, the spare wheel iron, the chains. These formed the floor that everything else rested on. The floor was never flat. There was always a barrel pressing up in one place, a toolbox making a ridge in another, a coil of rope finding its way to exactly where you needed to put your foot. Above the heavy layer, the middle thing, cooking tools wrapped in canvas, the medicine box, clothing in oilcloth bundles, seed bags for Oregon that would not be opened for 6 months, but had to stay dry for all 6 of those months. The bedding rolled tight and strapped during the day. Above everything, hanging from the bows on hooks and loops of leather, the lighter things that needed to be reachable, the lantern, the rifle, the small bag of coffee, and the tin cup Margaret kept within reach because there was always a moment before the campfire was properly going when someone needed coffee and needed it from the wagon. Here is what the paintings do not show. The family did not ride in the wagon. The wagon carried their belongings. The family walked. They walked because the oxen were already pulling 2,000 pounds and did not need more. They walked because the road was rough enough that riding in a fully loaded wagon meant being jolted over every rock and rut. The wagon bucking and tilting until the load shifted and settled with a grinding sound that made James turn to check that nothing had broken. The wagon was for the load. The people carried themselves. This meant that for most of the daylight hours, the inside of the wagon was inhabited only by the load. The barrels and tools and bedding and seed bags existed in there alone, shifting against their lashings on rough sections, riding steady on the good stretches, smelling increasingly of themselves as the days added up. And the smell is worth stopping on. In the first week of May, the wagon smelled of new canvas and raw timber and Missouri spring air. By the end of May, it smelled of those things, plus bacon grease and wood smoke and the dusty mineral smell of trail dirt that worked through every gap and settled on every surface. By July, it smelled of all of those things, plus the close, warm smell of people who had been working hard and sleeping in a small space and washing when water allowed. By September, it smelled like something that had been lived in hard for 4 months, that had absorbed the season, the way old wood absorbs weather. Clara would remember that smell for the rest of her life, not as something bad, as something that was completely itself, that existed nowhere else in the world, that belonged entirely to this space and this time. The inside of the wagon at night was different from the inside during the day. During the day, it was storage. At night, it became a sleeping place. The load reorganized by habit into something approaching flat. The bedding unrolled. The family arranged according to the geometry of their bodies and the space available. Tom usually slept under the wagon when the weather allowed, on a ground cloth with a blanket. He was 11 and preferred the cold and the space. He would later say that some of the best sleep of his life was under that wagon on the clear nights when the stars were the whole ceiling. Clara slept in the wagon always, against her mother, the cloth doll held against her chest in the same position she had always held it. James slept where he fit. Margaret arranged herself around everyone else. On the first night, when the camp was 6 miles outside of Independence, and the fire was built, and the children were settled, and the oxen were staked, James lay in the wagon, looking up at the canvas. The same diffuse glow as the day, but from moonlight now, cold and silver instead of warm. He thought about Tom lying on his back in the room in Missouri, looking at the ceiling. The same posture, different ceiling. He was quiet for a long time. Then Margaret said, from the dock beside him, without preamble, "The beans are going to be a problem by August." He said, "Why?" She said, "Because I packed for 4 months, and this is going to take 5. He was quiet. She said, "I know how to manage it. I am telling you so you know." He said, "All right." She said, "Go to sleep." He went to sleep. Outside, the oxen stood in the dark. The wagon sat in the grass with its canvas white in the moonlight, already a little different from the wagon that had stood in the yard in Boone County, already acquiring the quality of a thing that has begun its purpose. In the morning, it would move again. That was all it needed to do. The oxen moved. On the 8th morning, Tom made the first mark. He did it before anyone was awake, in the gray light just before the camp stirred, sitting on the wagon tongue with his knife and pressing a small notch into the wood of the sideboard, low down where it would not be noticed, deep enough that it would not wear away. 1 mark, 8 days. He had meant to start on the first day. The first day had been too full of the fact of itself to do anything other than exist inside it. The second day, the same. By the 8th day, he had settled enough to remember the idea, and the marks began. He did not know yet that he would make 147 of them. The first week of the Oregon Trail did not feel like history. It felt like waking before, 4 in the morning in the cold and the dark, when your body was still certain it was night. It felt like the stiffness of sleeping on a wagon bed made of barrel tops and board planks, softened by ticking that was not quite thick enough. It felt like the fire that had to happen before the coffee, and the coffee that had to happen before everything else. and the first cup held in both hands in the dark, while the camp came slowly to life around you, and the oxen made their low, patient sounds in the grass. Above everything else, it felt like repetition. This was what no guidebook prepared you for. The guidebooks described the landmarks and the river crossings and the mountain passes, the things that changed each day. They did not describe, because there was no way to describe it that conveyed the actual weight of it. The degree to which almost everything was the same each day. The routine installed itself by the third morning. 4 o'clock. James up and to the oxen. Tom up and to the fire. Margaret up and to the cooking before the fire was properly going. Working around Tom. Handing him wood. Starting the coffee while the flame was still low. Clara up last. Sitting on the wagon, tongue wrapped in her blanket. Holding the doll. Watching the camp wake with the serious attention of a 6-year-old who understood something important was happening without knowing exactly what. Breakfast by 5. On the trail by 6. Walk. 12 miles on a good day. 15. If the ground was firm and the animals were strong. 8. If the ground was soft, or a wheel needed attention, or a river crossing ran long. Stop at noon if water was near. Rest the oxen. Eat something cold, because there was no time to build a fire at midday. Then walk again. Stop at 4 or 5, when the captain decided the campsite was good enough. Unyoke the oxen. Let them graze. Build the fire. Cook. Eat. Check the wagon and the animals and the wheel grease and the harness for wear. Because a small problem caught at 4 in the afternoon was a repair of an hour, and the same problem found at 8 in the morning was a disaster. Sleep. Wake up and do it again? By the 4th day, Clara had stopped asking when they would get there. Not because anyone told her not to ask. She had looked at the faces around her and made the 6-year-old calculation that this question had an answer nobody wanted to give, and that the space the question made when it went unanswered was not a comfortable space. So she stopped asking. She turned her attention to the things directly around her. The way the grass moved in the wind, the color of the sky at different hours, the sound the wagon made on hard, dry dirt, a low rolling rumble you felt in your feet as much as heard, different from the quieter laboring sound it made on soft ground. She discovered that the canvas above the wagon had different colors depending on what the sky was doing. She did not tell anyone. These were hers. Tom discovered something different that first week. He discovered that his body had opinions about 15 miles that his mind had not been consulted on. By the 4th afternoon, his feet were delivering a sustained and detailed complaint. A full accounting of every mile, walked on ground harder than the fields at home. The soles of his shoes, which had seemed perfectly good in Missouri, were thinning in ways he could feel now. The particular hardness of gravel coming through leather in a way that would only get more specific as the weeks went on. He said nothing about his feet. He was 11, and he had too much pride and too much investment in being useful to say anything about his feet. He walked. On the 6th day, James's rear right wheel developed a sound, a dry catch on every rotation, barely audible over the noise of the trail. James heard it at mid-morning and said nothing for 2 hours, listening to it, tracking whether it was getting worse, doing the mental calculation about whether it was the wheel or the axle or the grease bucket. At the noon stop, he pulled the wheel and checked. The grease bucket had lost more than it should have through a crack in its lid, and the axle was running dry. A dry axle left alone became a seized axle. A seized axle on the trail was a day lost, and a repair that used resources better saved. James repacked the grease. He fixed the lid with a strip of leather and 2 nails. 40 minutes. The captain came by while James was working. He looked at the wheel and the axle and said, "Catch it early." James said yes. The captain said, "You would be surprised how many don't." He moved on. James finished and stood and wiped his hands on the grass and looked at the line of wagons waiting. He looked at Daniel's wagon 2 places back. At Daniel, standing with his arms crossed, watching with an expression that was not impatient but contained the potential for it. James looked at the wheel once more. Then he put the oxen back in and moved. That evening, after the children were asleep, James sat at the fire with his coffee and said nothing for a long time. Margaret sat across from him doing the same. The fire had burned to coals, and neither of them built it up. After a while, James said the axle. Margaret said, "I heard it this morning." He said, "It is fine now." She said, "I know." He said, "I will check it every morning." She said, "I know you will." They sat with the coals. Margaret said the beans. He said, "What about them?" She said, "I have been thinking about how to make them last. I can cut the supper portion if I add more cornmeal in the morning. No one will notice if I do it slowly enough." He looked at her across the fire. She said, "I am not asking permission. I am telling you so you know." He said, "All right." She looked down at her hands. The fire went to ash. The camp was quiet. The oxen stood at the edge of the firelight, patient and still, waiting for morning, the way animals wait for things that are coming regardless. Margaret had already started cutting the portions. She did it the way she did most necessary things, quietly, without announcement, before anyone had a chance to feel the absence of what she was managing. The paintings lie, not deliberately, but completely. They show a wagon moving through open country with the family inside or perched at the front. The man with the reins, the woman beside him, the children visible through the canvas opening. The wagon is the center of everything. The people are in it or on it. What the paintings leave out is the ground directly beside the wagon, where almost everyone was walking. Margaret Calloway walked from Missouri to Oregon, not beside a wagon moving at a comfortable pace on a decent road in fair weather, beside a wagon moving at the pace of oxen under load, roughly 2 miles an hour on flat ground and less on everything else, through 600 miles of prairie grass and river crossings and dust, and then through mountains that asked something entirely different of the body than the prairie had. She walked in a skirt that came to her ankles. On flat, dry ground, a long skirt is a garment. On the Oregon Trail, it becomes something else. In the dry stretches, it collected dust from the ground and held it, so that by midday, the hem was the color of the trail rather than the color of the cloth. In the wet stretches, it absorbed water and grew heavy, and heavy cloth against the legs for 12 miles is a different kind of walking. In the grass, it caught on things. At river crossings, it had to be held up with both hands, which meant crossing with your hands occupied and your footing uncertain, and the current doing what currents do. Margaret had 2 skirts. She wore them in rotation, washing one when she could, wearing the other until it was ready to be washed, which on the dry stretches meant wearing it longer than she would have liked. By the end of May, both skirts were a color that had no exact name. Not brown, not gray. The color the trail made. She walked because everyone walked. She cooked before walking and cooked after walking. She wrapped Clara's blisters when they came on the 9th day, cut cloth from a worn shirt, and kept walking. She tracked the food supply through every mile of every day, the number ticking down in the background of everything else she did. The way a sound you are trying not to hear keeps making itself heard. On the 16th day, she noticed her left foot. Not dramatically. She had taken her shoes off at a river crossing and put them back on after, and the fit was different on the left side. A tightness along the outer edge that had not been there in the morning. By mid-afternoon, she knew what it was. A blister of her own, forming where the wet leather had shifted against the skin over 6 miles of walking. She said nothing. She adjusted her stride slightly, moving her weight to reduce the friction, and kept walking. When they stopped that evening, she took off her shoes and treated the blister the same way she had treated Clara's, with cloth and careful wrapping, and put her shoes on the next morning without mentioning it to James. This was not stubbornness. It was the practical recognition that saying something about the blister changed nothing about the blister, and added something to James's load that he did not need when he already had enough to carry. What she was managing was not her foot. It was the sum of all the small degradations that added up over a day and a week and a month of this kind of travel. The blisters and the tired legs and the dust in her eyes and the smell of her own clothes after 3 days without washing, and the weight of the wet skirt and the particular kind of tired that comes not from one hard thing, but from the unrelenting repetition of hard things. She managed it the way she managed everything, by not looking at the sum, only at the next task, the next meal, the next mile, the next thing that needed doing. Women made up roughly half the people on the Oregon Trail in 1846. Many of the surviving accounts that tell us what the trail actually felt like were written by women. Amelia Stewart Knight recorded her moccasins wearing through the mud, the children's sicknesses, the prices at trading posts. Sarah Royce wrote about fear and faith and the particular quality of desert light. Most of the women on the trail wrote nothing down, or wrote it and did not keep it, or kept it and it did not survive. What survived is the trail itself, the worn groove of it in the landscape, the archaeology of what was left along it, and in the diaries that did survive, between the lines of practical details and practical decisions, is something that takes a while to see. It is the picture of women running households at a level of complexity and under conditions of stress that had no domestic equivalent, feeding families on shrinking provisions over variable terrain in all weather, managing the health of children who were tired and sometimes sick, maintaining the routines that kept a family functional when everything around them was anything but, doing all of this while walking 15 miles a day, not for a week, for 5 months. One evening, in the 3rd week, Margaret came in from checking the grain supply and stood at the back of the wagon for a moment before starting the fire. She stood with one hand on the tailboard and her eyes on the horizon, which was the same horizon it had been for 3 days. Clara came and stood beside her. She slipped her hand into Margaret's hand without saying anything. Margaret looked down at her. Clara looked up. Then Margaret started the fire. The beans that night were thinner than they had been in Missouri. Not noticeably thinner. Thinner in the way things become thinner when someone is paying very close attention. James ate his portion and said nothing. Tom ate his portion and asked for more. Margaret gave him more. She gave herself less. She did not think of this as sacrifice. She thought of it as arithmetic, the same arithmetic she had been running since January, the same arithmetic she would keep running until the Willamette Valley or until the supplies ran out. Whichever came first, she was almost certain it would be the valley. Almost. The fire had to happen before everything else, not because breakfast required it first, though breakfast did require it first, because the fire was proof that the day was starting, that the camp was functioning, that the system was working the way it needed to work. A cold camp in the morning was a camp already behind, and a camp already behind had a way of staying behind. On a trail where the distance between where you were and where you needed to be before winter closed, the mountain passes was measured in weeks. Behind was a condition you could not let settle in. Margaret built the fire. She had built fires her entire life, in hearths and cook stoves. But the trail fire was a different problem. There was no hearth to contain it. There was no dry hardwood stacked beside the door, seasoned through a winter into fuel that caught reliably and burned clean. On the Missouri stretch, there was wood, cottonwood and willow along the river bottoms. But cottonwood burned fast and willow burned smoky, and neither was the oak and hickory she had cooked over at home. Once they moved into the open country, there was no wood at all. What there was, in quantities that stretched to the horizon in every direction, was buffalo chips. The first time, Tom brought an armload of them into camp. In the second week, Clara looked at what he was carrying and looked at her mother and said, "Are those what I think they are?" Margaret said yes. Clara said, "And we are going to cook with them." Margaret said yes. Clara considered this. Then she said all right, and went to find more. Buffalo chips were the compressed, dried dung of the great herds that had moved through this country for thousands of years, leaving behind a fuel source that the Plains tribes had used for exactly the same purpose, for exactly that long. They burned at a lower temperature than wood. They did not hold coals the way hardwood held coals. A buffalo chip fire went from lit to finished faster, which meant you had to be ready with your cooking when the fire was ready. Not a few minutes after. They had a particular smell when they burned, dry and grassy, the smell of something that had been grass once and was returning to something like grass again. Not unpleasant exactly, but present, and the food cooked over it carried a faint quality of that difference. Something in the biscuits or the bacon that would not have been there in a Missouri kitchen. The family stopped noticing within a week. Breakfast was biscuits when Margaret had the time to make them, which was most mornings, because biscuits were the most efficient use of flour and fat for the work the day required. She mixed the dough in the dark by feel, the same proportions she had used for years. Flour and lard and a little salt and enough water to bring it together. She had the biscuits in the Dutch oven over the fire before the light was fully up. While the biscuits cooked, she started the bacon in the skillet. The salt pork from the barrel had been sliced the night before and left to soak in a little water to draw off some of the salt. Salt pork, eaten without soaking, was nearly inedible, and they needed people in this family eating with something like appetite. Coffee. The tin pot sat directly in the coals. Water and ground beans together, brought to a boil, and then moved back to steep. Strong and dark and full of grounds that settled to the bottom if you gave it time, and got into your teeth if you did not. Margaret drank hers with as much sugar as she could justify, which as the weeks went on became less and less. The whole operation, from fire starting to food on tin plates, took 40 minutes when everything went right. When something went wrong, when the chips were damp from overnight dew and would not light cleanly, when the wind shifted and blew the heat sideways, when the oxen had gotten loose and James was dealing with that instead of anything else, it took longer. Longer meant a later start. A later start meant a hotter midday walk and less afternoon before the light went. Margaret ran the breakfast operation alone, not by formal arrangement, by the logic of close quarters under pressure, the way things organize themselves when there is no time to discuss how things should be organized. James was better with the animals. Tom was learning the fire. Margaret was better with everything that required precision and timing and the management of multiple things at once, which was what cooking on the trail required above everything else. She did not resent this. She was good at it, and she knew she was good at it. And being good at something that matters is not a small thing. What she watched, through May and into June, was the barrels. Every morning when she went to the supply barrel for the day's flour, she registered, without looking directly at it, how much remained, the weight of the barrel when she tipped it, the sound of the flour shifting inside. She did the same with the bacon. With the beans she kept in a cloth sack and could feel through the cloth, the shape of it changing as the weeks went on. The beans were the problem she had already told James about. The dried fruit was going faster than planned because the children needed it more than she had planned. The trail diet without fruit produced a heaviness and irritability she had read about in the literature on scurvy and had decided to treat preventively rather than wait for symptoms. So the dried apples and the dried peaches and the small bag of raisins were going into the cooking more often than her original portions allowed. She adjusted. She always adjusted. The adjustments were small and invisible to everyone but her. A quarter cup less flour in the biscuits, made up in water. The bacon strips cut slightly thinner. The bean soup made with more water and cooked longer so the beans swelled more fully and the broth thickened and the portion looked like what it used to be. Tom ate without comment. Clara ate and asked about the taste of things. Not the quantity, the flavor, the texture, the way a thing was different today from yesterday. James noticed. He said nothing. Margaret had told him she was adjusting and he had said, "All right," and he meant it. And the proof was that he ate what he was given without asking for more. This was its own kind of respect. The respect of a man who understood that the person managing the food supply was doing something that required trust, and that the correct way to show trust was to stop counting. The noon stop was not a cooking stop. No time to build a fire at midday, and no benefit in it. The oxen needed to rest and graze for 40 minutes, regardless of what the people needed. And 40 minutes was not enough time to build a fire, cook, eat, break the fire, and be ready when the animals were ready. Midday was cold food, leftover biscuit from the morning, sometimes with lard spread on it, a piece of dried meat if there was some, water from the keg, warm from the sun by noon. carrying the taste of wood and leather and everything the water had passed through to get here. The noon stop was also when Margaret did the accounting. She did not write it down. She kept it in a part of her mind that ran alongside everything else. The way a farmer keeps track of weather in a part of his mind that never fully stops watching the sky. She knew, on any given day, in May or June, how much of each supply remained, how many days of trail lay ahead, what the gap between those two numbers looked like. In May, the gap was manageable. In June, it was tighter. She said nothing about June to James. Not yet. June was a problem for June. On the evening of the 31st day, after the camp was settled, and the children were in the wagon, and James was checking the animals, Margaret opened the flour barrel and measured out the next morning's portion. Then she held the scoop still over the barrel for a moment. Less than half full. She had known this was coming. She had been watching it come for 2 weeks. The line in the barrel dropping the same way water drops in a well during a dry summer. Slowly enough to pretend it was not dropping, until suddenly it was not possible to pretend anymore. She replaced the scoop and sealed the barrel. She stood in the dark of the wagon and listened to the camp around her. The oxen pulling at the grass, the low sound of someone's fire 2 wagons down, the night insects starting up in the grass. She thought about the barrel. Then she went to start her own fire for the morning, because the fire had to happen before everything else. And the morning was coming whether the barrel was ready for it or not. The captain called the meeting on the 38th day. He called it the way he called all meetings, by riding to each wagon in the evening and saying simply, "Fire circle after supper." Everyone understood. 23 wagons, roughly 85 people counting children, about 40 adults who could work and decide and hold opinions. They gathered in the low evening light, men mostly standing, women mostly seated on whatever was available, the older children at the edges, listening with the careful attention of children who understood that what the adults were deciding affected them directly. The issue was the Henderson wagon. Eli Henderson was 61 years old, a fact that had seemed less significant in Missouri than it did now. 7 weeks out and 700 miles in, with the train 3 days behind the pace the captain had set. Henderson had 2 oxen. Both were weakening. One had a sore on its left shoulder from the yoke that had not healed, because there was no rest for it to heal in. The issue was not Henderson himself, who was a capable man and knew it. The issue was pace, with Henderson's weakening animals setting a ceiling on how fast the rear of the train could move. The whole column was either pulling away or holding back. Holding back meant days. Days, in the captain's accounting, were not recoverable. He laid this out in the flat language he used for everything. No accusation, no sentiment. The facts were the facts. Then he asked for opinions. Daniel Calloways spoke first. He had been waiting to speak since the meeting was called. James had seen it in his brother's face at supper. The face of a man holding a position until the correct moment. Daniel stood with his arms at his sides and said what he had been thinking for 2 weeks. He said, "We are 3 days behind where we need to be. We have the mountains to think about. I do not think we can afford to let this continue." Someone asked, "What are you proposing?" Daniel said, "I am proposing We help the Hendersons in every way we can that does not cost us more days. We share our animals on the difficult sections. We help with repairs, but the pace of this train needs to be the pace the trail requires, not the pace of the slowest wagon. The fire circle was quiet. James spoke. He said, "I want to make sure I understand what you are saying." Daniel looked at him. James said, "Because what I hear is that if the Hendersons cannot keep up, we leave them." Daniel said, "I am saying the trail has a schedule. It does not negotiate." James said, "And I am saying a wagon train is an agreement. We made that agreement in Missouri. We said we would travel together." Daniel said, "Agreements made in Missouri were made without full information." James said they were made knowing that people might have trouble. That was always possible. That is why we made the agreement. The fire circle was quiet again. The captain had been listening with his arms folded, the posture of a man who had heard this argument before, because it was the argument every wagon train had. Eventually, he let the silence run. Then he said, "I want to hear from Henderson." Ely Henderson, sitting on a stump at the edge of the circle with his hat in his hands, looked up. He said, "I know what my animals are doing. I have been watching it for 2 weeks. He paused. "Then I bought the best I could afford." "Quiet," Henderson said. "I am not asking for charity. I am asking for 1 more week. If the sore heals, we keep pace. If it does not, I will make my own decision about what to do." The captain looked around the circle. He did not call for a formal vote. He read the faces the way he read weather and trail conditions, with the experience of a man who had learned that the correct decision and the popular decision were often different things, and that his job was to find where they overlapped. He said, "We give Henderson a week. We help with the animals on the hard sections. We keep the pace we can, and we see where we are in 7 days." Daniel sat back down without expression. James did not look at him. The meeting broke up, the way meetings break up after a difficult thing has been looked at and not resolved. People drifting back to their wagons with the subdued quality of a group that had seen something true and uncomfortable and decided to go to bed. James walked back to his wagon with Margaret beside him. She said, when they were out of earshot, "He is not wrong." James said, "I know." She said, "You are not wrong either." He said, "I know that too." She said, "That is the problem." He said nothing. She said, "Daniel counts days the way I count flour. He is afraid the mountain is going to cost us what we do not have." James said, "I am afraid of becoming the kind of people who leave an old man on the trail because his oxen are slow." Margaret said, "Those are both real fears." She stopped walking and looked at him. She said, "The question is, which one you can live with if you are wrong." James looked at the wagon. He said, "I do not know." She said, "No, neither do I." They went to bed without settling it, because it was not the kind of thing that got settled. It was the kind of thing you carried until the circumstances settled it for you, which they did eventually, the way circumstances on the Oregon Trail settled most things, not by resolving the question, but by making the question irrelevant. In the morning, the train moved. Henderson's oxen moved with it. For now, that was enough. Across the camp, Ruth lay awake beside Daniel for a while after the fire went out. She was thinking about Margaret, not about the meeting, about the way Margaret had sat through the whole thing with her hands in her lap and her face giving nothing away. The way Margaret always gave nothing away when she was paying the most attention. Ruth had known Margaret for 8 years. She knew that the stillness was not absence. The stillness was where Margaret kept her most important thinking, away from where anyone could see it. Ruth thought about what Margaret had decided tonight. She thought it was probably the same thing she herself had decided, which was this: what was happening between their husbands was not really about Henderson and his oxen. It was about James and Daniel and the different ways they read the same road. And at some point, probably not yet, but at some point, those two ways of reading were going to come to a place where they could not both be right at the same time. She did not know what would happen then. She pulled her blanket up and closed her eyes. In the morning, the oxen moved. Tom made his marks in the evening, always in the evening, after the camp was settled and the fire was going, and the adults were doing the things adults did after supper, the checking and the talking and the low murmur of decisions being made that he was not quite included in. He would go to the wagon and crouch at the sideboard and press the knife into the wood. 1 mark, and then run his thumb along the row from the beginning to feel how many there were without counting them. He did not always count them. Sometimes he just felt them. The row of small notches in the wood, each one a day that had happened and could not unhappen. There was something in that he could not have put into words, but that mattered to him. The way certain things matter to 11-year-olds before language catches up to them. By the 38th day, the row was long enough to reach from the front edge of the sideboard almost to the first iron bracket. He ran his thumb along it in the dark and thought, "We have been doing this for a long time." Then he went back to the fire. Clara's relationship to the trail was entirely different. She was not measuring it. She was inside it the way a 6-year-old is inside everything completely, without the layer of reflection that comes later. The layer that turns experience into something you can stand back and look at. Clara had no distance from it. She knew the smell of the wagon the way she knew the smell of her mother. She knew the sound of the oxen in the early morning, the low exhale they made when being yoked, a sound of patience that she had catalogued alongside everything else the trail was teaching her. She had made a game of the road. The game had no rules anyone else would have recognized. It involved watching the sky at different hours and noting how the light changed, watching which birds appeared over which kinds of ground, watching the way the lead oxen moved differently from the wheel oxen, watching the people in the wagons ahead and trying to understand from their posture what they were feeling. She did not explain the game to anyone. She played it in the running interior life of a 6-year-old who has found a way to be interested in her surroundings, which is the deepest form of managing a hard situation available to a person who does not yet have the vocabulary for managing hard situations. The doll was showing wear. The blue dress was fading from the sun and the handling. The bright blue of April becoming something softer. The face, which Margaret had embroidered with a small, careful smile and 2 dark eyes, had rubbed in the spot where Clara held it most often, against her chest when she slept, so that the left eye was slightly less dark than the right. Clara had noticed this. She did not mind. It seemed right to her that the doll should be changed by the trail the way everything else was changed by the trail, the way her own face had more sun in it than it had in Missouri. The way Tom's shoes were doing something at the heels that shoes at home did not do. The doll was coming with her. That was what mattered. What Clara understood about the adults in her family, in the way children understand things they have not been told directly, was that something was being held together by effort. She did not have words for this. She had the way her mother's hands looked at the end of a day. The particular set of them, the way they moved through the evening tasks with a precision that was working against a resistance Clara could feel but not name. She had the way her father stood at the wagon in the mornings before he called everyone up, the way he looked at the oxen and then at the sky and then at the trail ahead, the three-point check of a man making sure the thing he was responsible for was still holding together. She had the way Tom was sometimes very quiet. Tom's quiet on the trail was different from the quiet he had at home. At home, his quiet was the quiet of a boy thinking about something specific, a problem or a plan, something that would eventually come out as a question or a scheme. On the trail, his quiet was the quiet of someone who had seen something and had not yet decided what to do with it. She watched him. One evening, in the 6th week, when the camp was settled near a creek in the long grass country, Tom came and sat beside Clara at the back of the wagon, and they sat together without talking for a while. The particular silence of siblings who have spent enough time in close quarters to have their own language of quiet. After a while, Tom said, "Do you know what is happening?" Clara said, "We are going to Oregon." He said, "Yes. But do you know what that means?" She thought about it. She said, "It means we are not going home." He looked at her. She said, "The house is not ours anymore. Mama gave the key to Mr. Burgess." He said, "Does that bother you?" She considered this with the seriousness she brought to questions that deserved seriousness. She said, "The doll is here, and you are here, and Mama and Papa are here." She paused. She said, "Where is the home part of the home?" Tom looked at the doll in her hands. He said, "I do not know." She said, "I think it is us. I think we are the home part." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Maybe." He got up and went to make his mark on the sideboard. Clara watched him do it. The crouch, the knife, the small press of the blade into the wood. She had watched him do this many times and had never asked about it. She asked now. She said, "What are the marks for?" He said, "So I know how many days." She said, "Why do you want to know?" He thought about it. He said, "So I do not lose track." She looked at the row of marks. She counted to herself, moving her lips slightly. She said, 38. He said, "Yes." She said, "That is a lot." He said, "Yes." She said, "How many more?" He looked at the marks for a moment. He said, "A lot more." She nodded, as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. Then she went back to her doll. Tom stood at the wagon for a while after that, not making another mark, just standing there with his hand on the sideboard in the cooling evening. The camp sounds around him, the fire and the low talk and the animals at the edge of the grass. He thought about what she had said. "I think we are the home part." He pressed his thumb against the last mark. Then he went to help his father with the oxen, because that was what there was to do. And doing it was better than standing there counting days he had not yet lived. That night, Margaret lay in the wagon after the children were asleep and listened to the camp go quiet. She listened to James's breathing slow into sleep. She listened to Clara, curled against her with the doll, making the small adjustments of a child settling deeper. She lay in the dark and ran the accounting. 38 days. Roughly 450 miles. The flour was below half. The beans were a problem. The dried fruit was going faster than planned. The oxen were holding. 1,200 miles remaining. She lay with this number the way you lie with a number too large to do anything about tonight, but too important to put down. Then she closed her eyes. In the morning the oxen would move and she would start the fire, and the day would begin the way all the days began, with the dark and the cold and the work that had to be done before everything else. And the problem of the flour would be the same size it was tonight, waiting for her, the way problems wait when you have no choice but to sleep. She slept. The Platte River ran beside them for 200 miles. It ran wide and shallow, and the color of the dirt it moved through, a brown so complete and consistent that you stopped seeing it as a color and started seeing it simply as the river. The water moved through a channel that could be half a mile wide and less than 3 feet deep in the low water months of summer, carrying so much suspended sediment that a cup of it held to the light showed more than water. You could watch the particles moving. You could feel them when the water was in your mouth. You drank it anyway. Margaret let it settle overnight in the water barrel, the sediment dropping slowly to the bottom over 8 hours, until the top 2/3 held something approaching clear water, and the bottom third held something that was mostly river. She drew from the top. She boiled what she could when the fire and the time allowed. She added a little vinegar because an older woman in the train named Mrs. Pratt, who had made this crossing once before, said that vinegar helped, and, in the absence of certainty, you accepted help from wherever it offered itself. The taste of Platte River water, processed through this method, was the taste of the trail. It became simply the taste of water, the only water there was, and the body adjusted to it. The way the body adjusts to things it cannot change. James was more careful about what he could see. He had started reading the ground near water sources 3 weeks in. After a man, 2 wagons ahead, lost a mule to a pond that had looked fine until it did not. After that, James watched the margins of every source they came to. The soil clung back to the water's edge, whether the grass grew all the way to the water or stopped short, which was its own sign. Grass growing to the water's edge was usually good. Bare margins with a pale whitish crust in the soil meant alkali concentration, water that could weaken or kill animals if they drank enough of it. He had assembled this knowledge from the guidebooks and the men who had been before, and the signs that previous trains had left beside bad sources. Small cairns of stones or scratched warnings on bark. The communication system of people who understood that whoever came next would face the same problems and might benefit from a few words left in the landscape. On the 44th day, they came to a spring in a low rise, the first water that had not come from the river in 2 weeks. Several people in the train moved toward it with the enthusiasm of people tired of Platte water wanting something different. James was at the spring first. He crouched and looked at the ground around it. The soil at the margin was pale, almost white in places. The grass stopped 4 feet from the edge. There was a faint smell in the air near the water. Not strong, but present. He stood up. He said, loudly enough for the people moving toward it, "I would wait on this one A man named Garrett said, "What is the problem?" "James," said the margin. "The soil." He paused. "Then smell the air, right at the water." Garrett crouched and smelled. He stood up and walked back to his wagon without a word. The train watered from the Platte that evening. Margaret had watched from 20 yards away, holding the water keg she had been about to carry to the spring. She watched James crouch and look and stand and speak. Watched the small group of people redirect. Watched Garrett's face when he smelled the air. She said nothing about it until that night. Then she said, "How did you know?" James said, "The grass, the soil. I have been watching it." She said, "For how long?" He said, "Since Morrison's mule." She looked at him. He said, "I should have told you what I was watching for." She said, "Yes, you should have." He said, "The margins. If the grass grows to the water, it is usually all right. If it stops short, go slow." She put this in the same place she put all the information that mattered. The running inventory of everything that stood between this family and a serious problem. The margins of water sources. She would watch them now. Sickness moved through wagon trains on the Oregon Trail, the way weather moves through country. Invisibly and without regard for individual circumstance. It moved through contaminated water, through unwashed hands, through the simple proximity of people living and eating and moving through the same space for months. Every family knew this. Every family managed it with the tools available, which were limited and imperfect and better than nothing. Margaret boiled what she could and settled what she could not boil, and added the vinegar and drew from the top of the barrel and watched the children's water the way she watched everything, with the continuous low attention of a person who understood that the problems she was preventing were invisible and the problems she missed would not be. On the 47th day, one of Henderson's oxen drank from a poor source at a midday stop before James saw it, and before anyone could redirect it. The animal was sick by evening, better in 2 days. Weakened, but functional. Henderson did not lose it. James stood at his wagon that night for a long time after supper, looking at his own oxen at the edge of the firelight. He went over the sequence of events at midday, where he had been, when he had seen it, what the margin had looked like, and whether he should have seen it sooner. He went over it twice. He went to bed without a conclusion. Margaret had seen him standing there and said nothing, because the thing he was doing was the same thing she did with the flour and the beans. The running review of what had happened and what it meant for what came next. And it was private work that required no company. One evening, near the end of the Platte stretch, Margaret filled the cups for supper and handed them to the children and looked at Clara as she drank. Clara drank without hesitation. She held the cup in both hands, the way she had held every cup since Missouri, with the complete trust of a child who has never been given a reason to doubt what is put in front of her. Margaret watched her drink. Then she filled her own cup. She drank. The Platte ran on beside them, wide and shallow, and the color of the country it moved through. And the train moved along its bank through the long summer days, drinking what it offered and making it safe enough to drink and moving forward. Always forward. With the mountains in the future and Missouri in the past and the water in between being whatever it was going to be. You made it work. You had no other option. So you made it work. The grass went on. That is the only way to say it that comes close to the reality of it. The grass went on in every direction for so long and so completely that the word horizon stopped meaning the edge of what you could see and started meaning something else. Something closer to the edge of what the mind could hold. You looked west, and the land was flat and grassed and empty of anything vertical for 30 miles. You looked north, and it was the same. South, the same. Behind you east, the same. Except that behind was the direction no one was going, and most people stopped looking that way after the first week. The sky was enormous. Not the pleasant enormous of a painting, the enormous of a presence that sat on you, that offered no relief from itself, no tree line to interrupt it, no hill to rest your eyes on. It was simply there, from one edge of the world to the other, all day, every day. And after 2 weeks of it, the size of it stopped feeling like freedom and started feeling like pressure. The heat came down from it without filter. By 10 in the morning, in mid-June, the air was warm enough that walking required effort against the heat as well as the distance. By noon, the ground radiated it back up, so that you felt it from 2 directions at once. By 2 in the afternoon, the dust kicked up by wagon wheels and ox hooves hung in the air behind the train in a long pale plume that settled into everything, into the food and the water and the clothing and the corners of your eyes. Margaret kept a piece of damp cloth in her apron pocket for her eyes. She re-wetted it at the water stops and used it through the day when the dust was bad. By evening it was the color of the trail. She rinsed it in whatever water was available and put it back in her pocket for the next day. James walked with his hat low and his eyes on the ground in front of him. He had found the plains walk in the 2nd week. The particular gait the country seemed to require. Not the upright stride of a man covering familiar ground, but something lower and more patient. A walk that expected nothing from the next mile, because the next mile was going to be exactly the same as the current mile and the mile before it. The only thing that varied was the small details of the ground itself. A change in the grass, a dry creek bed to cross, a scatter of buffalo bones white against the brown soil. He looked at the ground because the ground was manageable. The sky and the distance were not manageable. You could not do anything about them. They were simply what they were. The vast indifferent fact of the plains. And the correct response to a vast indifferent fact was to put your head down and walk. Daniel walked differently. Daniel had always been a man who moved through space with deliberate efficiency. No wasted motion. No unnecessary pauses. On the plains, this became a forward-leaning stride, slightly faster than James's pace. Not dramatically faster, perhaps a quarter mile per hour at most. But over the course of a day, that added up, and Daniel kept the number in his head the way Margaret kept the flower count. He started saying it in the evenings, not as an accusation, as a fact placed in the air between them. On the 52nd day, he said, "We lost half a mile today at the creek." James said the crossing was soft. Daniel said, "I know why we lost it. I am telling you we lost it." James said, "We will make it up if the ground is firm tomorrow." Daniel said, "And if it is not, we lose more." He looked at his brother. "We have the South Pass, and we have the blues, and we need to be through the mountains before the 2nd week of October. 3 days behind becomes a week behind, and a week behind becomes a conversation I do not want to have." James said, "I know the calendar." Daniel said, "Then walk like you know it." They stood looking at each other, In the evening light, two men with the same face, arranged differently by the same information, reading the same road in two completely different languages. James said, "We will make it." Daniel said, saying, "That does not make it true." He went back to his wagon. James stood where he was for a moment. Then he looked west, which was the only direction that mattered. And the plains went on to the horizon, flat and grassed, and entirely indifferent to the question of whether the Calloway brothers agreed on anything. Chimney Rock appeared on the 59th day. It came the way landmarks come on the plains. Not suddenly, but gradually. A shape on the horizon different from the horizon. A vertical interruption in the long horizontal sameness. First barely distinguishable from distant shimmer. Then, unmistakably, a thing. A specific thing, rising from the flat country, with the patient permanence of something that had been there long before any wagon rolled past it. Tom saw it first. He was walking ahead of the wagon in the morning when his legs were fresh, and he stopped and looked at the horizon, and looked again and said, "There." Clara came up beside him and looked where he was pointing. She said, "What is it?" He said, "The rock, the Chimney Rock." From the guidebook? She looked at it for a long time. It was still perhaps 30 miles away, which on the plains meant 2 full days. She thought that because she could see it, it must be close. She thought they might be there by afternoon. She watched it all morning, and it did not get noticeably larger. By noon she understood. She said nothing. She adjusted her understanding of how distance worked in this country, which was different from how distance worked anywhere else she had been. And she filed this adjustment in the same place she filed all the things the trail was teaching her. The train reached Chimney Rock on the 61st day. It stood 300 feet above the surrounding plain, a column of pale rock rising from a broader base, the landmark that every diarist on the Oregon Trail had written about. The thing that told you the first real test of the mountains was still ahead, but no longer entirely abstract. People stopped and looked at it. Even Daniel stopped and looked. He stood with his arms at his sides and his face tilted up at the column of rock, and was quiet for a full minute, which was a long time for Daniel. Then he said, to no one in particular, "That is something." James stood beside him. He said yes. They stood together, looking at it. Two brothers on the same road. And for that minute the calendar, and the pace, and the Henderson oxen, and the question of who was right about what did not exist. There was only the rock and the sky, and the plains going out to the horizon. And the fact that they had come a very long way from Boone County, and there was still a very long way to go. Then Daniel said, "We need to move." James said yes. The train moved. That evening Tom made his mark on the sideboard. He ran his thumb along the full row from the first notch to the 61st, the length of it under his thumb. He thought about Clara's question from 3 weeks ago. Where is the home part of the home? He thought about what she had said. "I think it is us." He pressed his thumb against the last mark. Then he went to supper. The plains continued for another week after Chimney Rock, because the plains do not end simply because you have seen a landmark. The landmark told you where you were. It did not change where you needed to get to, but something had shifted in the people walking beside it. Some degree of settling into the fact of the journey that had not been there before. They had come far enough that the question was no longer whether they could do this. The question was what it would cost before it was done. That evening Daniel walked to his brother's fire and sat down without being invited, and accepted a cup of coffee without being asked if he wanted one. He said, 3 days behind where I want to be. James said, I know. Daniel said, I need you to understand that I mean it about the calendar. It is arithmetic, not opinion. James looked at him over the fire. He said, I understand it. Daniel said, all right. He drank his coffee. He said that was something today. The rock? James said yes, it was. They sat at the fire in the way brothers sit at fires, in a quiet that had the shape of everything they had not finished saying and might not ever finish saying. Some things between brothers do not need finishing. They just need to be there. Eli Henderson died on a Thursday. Not suddenly. The trail did not deal in sudden when it came to illness. Not this kind. The kind that moved through the body with a slow, grinding inevitability that everyone in the camp had watched arriving for 2 weeks and that no one had been able to stop. He had been weakening since the water crossing at the bad spring. Whether the spring had anything to do with it, or whether the illness had been in him already, waiting for the conditions that travel and heat and poor sleep provide to something that is waiting to become serious. No one could know for certain. The result was the same. By the 65th day, he could not keep food down. By the 68th day, he was in the wagon full time. On the 71st day, which was the Thursday, he did not wake up. His son-in-law, Avery, came to the captain's wagon at first light with his hat in his hands and said what he had to say. The captain sent word through the camp, and the camp organized itself around the fact of it with the quiet efficiency of people who have been living close together long enough that the machinery of response works without being assembled. The women came to Ruth Henderson, not in a group, not formally, but in the way women come to a place where something has happened, one and then another, until the space held enough of them to be useful. Margaret was the third to arrive. She did not say much. She had been at enough bedsides and gravesides to know that the words people say at those moments, the words meant to help, often do not help, and sometimes make the helped person work harder than they should have to at that moment. Work to receive the comfort being offered and to make the right face in response to it. So she sat with Ruth and did what her hands found to do, which was to begin quietly straightening the interior of the Henderson wagon, moving the things that needed moving, creating a small pocket of order in a space that grief had made disordered. Ruth sat with her hands in her lap. She said, once 61 years old. Margaret said yes. Ruth said he wanted to see Oregon. Margaret said nothing. Ruth said he talked about it for 3 years. The valley. He had a letter from a man he went to school with 40 years ago, who had gone out in 43. He read that letter so many times the paper went soft. Margaret looked at her. Ruth said, I do not know if I still have that letter. I think it is in the chest under the seat. Margaret said, I will find it. She found it in a small bundle of papers tied with string. She put it in Ruth's hands, and Ruth held it without opening it. Her fingers folded over it and looked straight ahead. The burial took half a day. The ground was not soft enough to dig deep, which was the cruel arithmetic of the trail. The same arithmetic that governed everything else. They dug what they could. They placed stones over it, a cairn of pale plains rock. enough weight to deter what disturbed graves in open country. The captain said words from a Bible he kept in his coat pocket. Words adequate to the occasion, the way any true words are adequate to an occasion, not enough. But what was available? And everyone knew it. The train stood in a rough gathering around the grave. The sky was high and white with thin clouds. The wind came from the northwest. The grass moved through it in long, slow waves, and the road ran west without interruption, toward the mountains still 2 weeks away. Afterward, when people were beginning to drift back to their wagons, Margaret was near the grave straightening the last of the stones. She saw something in the grass, a small dark disk, slightly larger than a thumbnail. A coat button. It had come off Henderson's coat during the preparation, rolled away in the grass, been missed in everything that needed doing. She picked it up. She held it in her palm. It was a plain, brown button, the kind that held a working coat closed against Missouri winters and plains winds and all the ordinary cold of an ordinary life. She walked to Ruth Henderson and opened Ruth's hand and placed the button in it. She said nothing. Ruth looked at the button for a long moment. Then she closed her fingers around it and held it against her chest without looking up. Margaret went back to her wagon. The train organized itself to move. The sequence of activity that had become automatic over 2.5 months, the yoking and the loading and the checking and the slow forward movement of 23 wagons returning to their order on the road. Henderson's wagon moved with them. Avery drove it. Ruth sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap and her face forward. The posture of a woman who has made the internal decision to continue, which is not the same as the decision to be all right. It is simply the decision to move, which is the only decision the road offers. James walked beside his wagon and did not look back at the gravesite after the first 100 yards. There was no use in looking back. Margaret walked and watched the ground in front of her feet and counted her steps the way she counted things when she needed, her mind doing something simple, while the rest of her processed something that was not simple and not manageable. Clara walked beside her mother and held her hand and said nothing. She had stood at the edge of the gathering at the grave with Tom and watched what happened. She had seen enough to understand the shape of it. The shape of people standing around a hole in the ground in a formal and sad arrangement. She understood that Mr. Henderson was not going to Oregon. She held her mother's hand and walked. Tom made his mark that evening without ceremony. He crouched at the sideboard and pressed the knife into the wood and made the notch. Then he did not move for a moment, still crouched, his thumb resting against the row of marks. 71 of them. He thought about something his father had said to Daniel weeks ago at the fire circle. A wagon train is an agreement. He thought about what that meant in its plain sense. Something people made between themselves, in advance, about what they would do for each other when the situation required it. Mr. Henderson had been part of that agreement, and now Mr. Henderson was under a pile of pale stones on the plains, and the agreement continued without him, because the agreement was not with any one person. It was with the road and the direction and the distance remaining, and none of those things stopped for any particular grief. He stood up. He went to the fire where his parents were sitting. He sat down between them, which he did not usually do. He usually sat across or to the side. Tonight he sat between them and nobody remarked on it, and they sat together at the fire until it went down to coals. Then they went to bed. In the morning the oxen were yoked before the sun was fully up. James checked each one with his hands. The yoke fit, the shoulder skin, the legs. He stood back. He said, quietly, to no one, "All right." The oxen moved. The wagon moved with them. The road ran west under the wide white sky, and the train followed it. 23 wagons moving through the grass with the patient and relentless quality of something that had decided what it was going to do and was doing it. Behind them, the cairn of pale stones stood in the grass. The wind moved over it. The grass moved in the wind. The road did not look back. They smelled it before they saw it. Not the fort itself exactly, but the concentration of human activity around it. The compound smell of livestock and cook fires and tanned leather and unwashed people and fresh-cut wood that accumulates wherever a significant number of humans and animals have been occupying the same ground for an extended period. After 11 weeks on the plains, where the dominant smell was grass and dust and the clean mineral, nothing of open country, the smell of Fort Laramie reached the train 2 miles out and produced in the people walking beside their wagons a reaction that was difficult to name precisely. Not comfort. Recognition. The recognition of a smell that meant people had been here before you and had built something and were still here, which, on the Oregon Trail, in the summer of 1846, was not a small thing. The fort sat on the north bank of the Laramie River where it met the North Platte, a collection of adobe and log buildings inside an enclosure wall, an American Fur Company trading post that had become the most important resupply point on the Oregon Trail by virtue of being the only significant structure between the Missouri River departures and Fort Hall. 800 miles further west. It was not large. It was not comfortable by any standard that had applied to life in Missouri. But it had walls and a roof and a store that sold things and a blacksmith who could fix things and people who were not the same. 85 people the train had been looking at for 11 weeks. Webb brought the train in at midday on the 78th day. The fort was busy with the organized chaos of a place existing at the intersection of several different worlds. Emigrants from other trains were camped in the meadows outside the wall. Wagons in various states of repair. Oxen grazing on the river grass. Fur traders moved through with the unhurried efficiency of men who lived here and regarded the seasonal influx of emigrants as a fact of their landscape. A group of Sioux men sat near the main gate, watching the incoming wagons with attention that was neither hostile nor welcoming, simply observant. The attention of people watching traffic move through their country. James looked at the Sioux men as he walked in through the gate. One of them, older, with a blanket over his shoulders despite the heat, looked back. They held the look for a moment. Then James moved on, and the man moved his attention to the next wagon. Unremarkable. The kind of moment that happened dozens of times a day at Fort Laramie in the summer months when the worlds it connected were in motion. The store was a room smelling of coffee and leather and the stale warmth of enclosed spaces in summer. Margaret walked through it slowly, doing 2 things at once, looking at what was available and running the calculation in her head of what they needed against what they could afford. The prices were what the trail made them. Coffee that had cost 12 cents a pound in Independence cost 40 cents here. Flour that had been 2 cents a pound in Missouri was 12 cents at Fort Laramie. A new ox cost 2.5 times what it had cost at the departure point. This was not gouging in any meaningful sense. It was the economics of a single trading post at the end of an 800-mile supply line. And everyone who arrived there understood it, which did not make it less painful to open your purse and count what was left. Margaret bought coffee. She stood at the counter and counted out the money and received the coffee and put it in her basket and felt the particular satisfaction of a decision made correctly. A decision made after calculating the alternatives and finding them worse. Coffee was the thing that got people moving at 4:30 when the morning offered no other reasons. She had paid 40 cents a pound and did not regret it. She also bought a paper of needles. Her supply was down to 4, 2 of which were bent in ways that made them unreliable. Needles on the trail were worth considerably more than their weight in almost anything else, because the things that held this family together, literally, were stitched. And the things that were stitched wore and tore and needed stitching again, continuously. For as long as the trail lasted, she put the needles in the inside pocket of her apron where they would not be lost. James spent the afternoon at the blacksmith's. The rear axle had been speaking to him for a week, not with the clarity of something failing, but with the low, persistent communication of something wearing in a way that preferred to be addressed sooner rather than later. The blacksmith, a broad man named Cotter, who had been at the fort for 4 years and had looked at more wagon axles than he could count, examined it without expression, and said it would last to the mountains if they were careful and might give trouble on the descent if they were not. He charged James $3 to reinforce it. James paid without argument. $3 was $3. A broken axle in the Blue Mountains was a catastrophe. The arithmetic was simple. Daniel finished his repairs by the time James was done, and came to find him at the wagon that evening. He said, "I talked to a man who came through last week, going the other way." James said, "Going back." Daniel said, "Going back." He made it as far as the Snake River and turned around. He said the crossing he had planned to use was not crossable. James said, "There are other crossings." Daniel said, "I know." He paused. He said he also told me something else, about a group that went south out of here, maybe a month ahead of us, California bound, taking a new route, a shortcut someone had been advertising, saving 400 miles. Apparently, James said, "I have heard about it." Daniel said, "So have I." He looked at his brother. "I am not suggesting we change routes. We are going to Oregon, and that is where we are going." James said, "Then why are you telling me?" Daniel said, "Because I want you to understand that a man with a plan and a man without a plan both face the same mountains. The plan does not remove the risk. It just means you saw it coming." He paused. He said, "The calendar, James, after here. The road is different." Webb said so. "The terrain is different. The water is more variable. And we have less room for problems than we have had so far." James looked at the fort around them, the traders finishing their transactions, the emigrants returning to their camps, the fires going up in the meadow in a scattered constellation, representing dozens of families at the same midpoint of the same hard road. He said, "I hear you, Daniel." Daniel said, "All right." He went back to his wagon. That evening, for the first time since Missouri, the Calloways ate supper without counting anything. It was Margaret's decision. She made it without announcement, simply cooking with a slightly fuller hand than she had been using for weeks. the bacon not quite as thin, the gravy a shade richer, the coffee as strong as it was supposed to be rather than stretched, she said, when the plates were out and the family seated eat. Nobody argued. Tom ate with the focused attention of a boy whose body had been asking for more than it was getting for weeks. Clara ate with the contentment of a child whose trust in her mother's table had never wavered, regardless of what the table offered. James looked at Margaret across the fire. She looked back at him. He said the needles. She said 4. Plus the paper I bought today. 20 in the paper. He said good. She said the axle. He said $3. Cotter says it will hold. She said all right. They ate. The fort was quiet around them. The way it got quiet in the evenings, when the trading was done and the repairs were finished and the decisions had been made and people were simply being people for a few hours, sitting with their families in the ordinary warmth of supper and fire and the company of people you knew. Ahead of them was the South Pass and the Snake River and the Blue Mountains and everything. Those things asked of a family and their animals. Behind them was Fort Laramie, the place where the road changed into something harder than it had been. The coffee was strong. The fire was good. For 1 hour, the Calloway family sat in the ordinary warmth of it without counting what was in the barrels or measuring the miles or thinking about the calendar. 1 hour. It was enough. The road did not begin at Independence, Missouri. This is something the emigrants understood in an abstract sense before they left, and in a different sense as the trail moved west and the evidence of long human habitation became impossible to miss for anyone paying attention. The attention varied. Some people in the train looked at the country they were moving through and saw terrain, obstacles, opportunities, the practical geography of a road that needed to be traveled. Some looked at the same country and began to understand, gradually, that the word empty, which appeared often in the letters and guidebooks that had brought them here, was a word chosen by people who had decided in advance what they were looking for and found only that James was in the second group. He had not started there. At the start, in Missouri, he had read the word wilderness without much examination, had understood Oregon as a place that needed people in it, had accepted, without thinking about it, the general proposition that the road west was a road into something new. The plains had been changing this, not dramatically, and not in any single moment. In the accumulated evidence of small things that did not fit the word empty, the trails through the grass, older than any wagon rut, worn deep by generations of foot traffic that had moved through this country long before any emigrant had thought to follow. The circles of stones on the high ground that the captain pointed out on the 43rd day, places where camps had been made over and over, for longer than anyone in the train could calculate. The markings on certain rock faces that James had ridden close to examine, clearly made by human hands, clearly meant to mean something to whoever came after. The people who made those things were not gone. They were here. The first encounter came on the 63rd day, 2 days east of Fort Laramie. 6 Sioux men came to the train from the north, riding at a deliberate and unhurried pace, approaching the lead wagon and stopping at a distance that was clearly calculated, close enough to communicate, far enough to make a point about whose country this was. The captain went out to meet them. He had a limited knowledge of the Sioux language, enough for basic exchange, supplemented by hand signals that had developed across the plains as a common language between peoples who did not share words. He went without a rifle and without the performance of authority that some wagon train captains adopted. He stood in the grass with the 6 riders and conducted what appeared from a distance to be a negotiation, measured and mutual, neither side performing alarm or aggression. After perhaps 15 minutes, the captain came back and said, "They want to trade. They have robes and dried meat. They want flour and sugar and metal tools." The train had a brief internal discussion in looks and low words rather than a formal meeting. Most people traded. James walked out with a cup of sugar and a small iron nail puller he had 2 of and could spare. He received in return a piece of buffalo hide that had been tanned to a softness he had not expected, smooth and even grained, in a way his own tanning never quite achieved. The transaction took 2 minutes. The man who handed him the hide was perhaps 35, wearing a blanket over one shoulder, watching James with an expression that was evaluative, in the same way James imagined his own expression was evaluative. 2 people trying to determine if they were dealing fairly with someone they did not know. James held up the nail puller. The man took it and turned it over in his hands and handed it to the man beside him, who turned it over and handed it back. The man nodded. James nodded. That was the whole of it. He walked back to the wagon and said nothing about it, because there was nothing to say that would not either inflate the moment or diminish it. Margaret examined the hide that evening and said, "This is better work than I can do." James said yes. She said, "I can use this for Clara's shoes if they wear through, or patches." He said, "That is why I got it." She folded it carefully and put it in the oilcloth bundle with the spare fabric. The second thing happened on the 75th day. 3 days before Fort Laramie, the train came around a low rise and into a broad flat where a creek ran and the grass was good, the kind of place natural for a camp, that had probably served as a camp for travelers and hunters and moving people for as long as this country had had people moving through it. In the flat, about a 1/4 mile from the trail, was what had been a village. Not ruins in any complete sense, suggestions of structures, the remains of frameworks that had collapsed and been collapsed further by weather, the kind of evidence that requires some knowledge of what it was to recognize what it is. Circles in the ground, the depressions where lodges had stood, the scorched stones of fire pits, the particular way the grass grew differently over the disturbed soil than in the ground around it. It was not abandoned the way a place is abandoned when people leave by choice. James looked at it for a long time from the trail. The captain came up beside him. James said, "What happened there?" The captain was quiet for a moment. He said, "Sickness. A few years back. Went through several camps along this stretch." He paused. "The kind that travels with people who have not had it before." James said nothing. The captain said, "There were people here a long time before we were, and the road has been changing things for them since before your wagon or mine ever rolled on it." He moved on. James stood and looked at the flat a moment longer. The circles in the ground, the scorched stones, the grass growing differently over the disturbed soil. He did not have the language for what he was looking at in the way he needed to understand it. He only knew the road was not empty, and that in some places it looked as if something had passed through long before the wagons ever came, and that what had passed through had not been kind. He walked The road west was not empty. It had been emptied by disease and by the pressure of migration that had been building for years before the Calloways or anyone like them had ever made a list of what to pack. James did not know the full history of this. He would not learn it in any organized way. Most of the emigrants on the trail that summer would not, but some of them looked. James looked at the flat with its evidence of people who had been there. Then he looked at the road ahead. Then he walked. Clara had been watching her father stand still from the wagon. She watched him look at the flat and then look at the road and then start walking again. She watched his face when he came back into her line of sight, and she catalogued the expression on it in the way she catalogued everything, without analysis, purely as information to carry forward into an understanding not yet available to her. She did not ask him what he had been looking at. She looked at the flat herself as the wagon passed it. She saw the circles in the grass, the different colored growth over the disturbed soil, the stones of old fires. She saw them the way children see things, directly and without the framework of historical knowledge that would come later. And the seeing was, in some ways, cleaner for that, more honest about what was actually there. People had lived here. They were not here now. She looked at the circles in the grass for as long as they were in sight. Then the wagon moved on, and the flat fell behind, and the road ran west under the high white sky, and the train kept its pace, the way the train always kept its pace, because the pace was what there was, and the road required it. The oxen moved. The wagon moved with them, and the flat with its circles in the grass became part of the long trail of things that this journey was made of. The things seen and the things not yet understood, traveling forward with the family, the way all such things travel, in the body, in the silence between one day and the next, waiting for a language that might eventually catch up to them. The rocking chair appeared on the 89th day. It was sitting upright at the side of the trail in the thin morning light, as if someone had placed it there with intention, which someone had. A straight-backed rocker with a woven seat, the kind that sat beside a hearth in a Missouri or Ohio parlor and held a woman through long evenings of mending and watching the fire. The wood was good oak. The joints were still tight. The rockers were unworn. There was nothing wrong with it except that it weighed 30 pounds, and 30 pounds was 30 pounds, and somewhere behind them, in the hours before this morning, a family had made the calculation, and the chair had lost. Tom saw it first. He was walking ahead of the wagon in the early morning quiet. In the gray light, before the sun was fully up, when the trail was at its best, cool and still, the dust not yet stirred by the day's traffic. He stopped and looked at the chair, and then looked back at the wagon, and then looked at the chair again. He did not say anything. He walked on, but he looked at it the way he was learning to look at things on this trail. The careful, attentive look that stored what it saw, rather than just passing over it. The look that understood that what was here at the side of the road was a fact about something, and that facts deserved their full weight. The chair was the first. By noon there was a writing desk. By mid-afternoon, a set of wooden bed frames leaning against a boulder, disassembled. Each piece laid neatly against the rock, with the care of people who could not simply drop things and leave them, who needed even the leaving to be orderly. By evening, a cast-iron stove, the kind that had been the center of a kitchen for years, standing nearly waist-high at the side of the road as if waiting for someone to come back for it. This stretch of trail was where the road began to show you what the journey actually cost. Not in blood or dramatic crisis, though those things were real and ahead. In furniture, in the accumulated domestic weight of what people had believed they needed when they stood in their barns in March and did the calculation that Margaret had done and arrived at a different answer, a more optimistic answer, an answer that had held through Missouri and through the plains and through the Platte crossing, and that was failing now against the hard physical evidence of what their animals could carry over and beyond. Margaret walked past it all with her eyes forward. She had seen this coming. She had made her decisions in March precisely to avoid standing in front of this kind of reckoning in August. She had not enjoyed making those decisions, but she had made them. And she did not look at the rocking chair, or the writing desk, or the stove, with the grief that some of the other women in the train allowed themselves. Because she had done her grieving already in the barn in Missouri. When she put her hand on the writing desk and ran her finger along the worn edge and then drew a line through it on the list, she looked forward, but she kept the list, not on paper, in her head, in the place that kept everything that needed keeping. The rocking chair left at Edith Warren's house with a note saying to use it or sell it. The writing desk left in the barn. The second set of curtains. The copper-preserving pot that had been her grandmother's, that she had held for a full 10 minutes in the barn before putting it down. The crock of preserved quince she had made in September, specifically to bring, which had seemed so small on the scale, and had been one of the last things cut. She kept the list the way you keep the names of people who are gone. Not because looking at it changes anything, but because forgetting it seems worse than carrying it. The piano appeared on the 91st day. It stood at the side of the trail with its keyboard facing east toward the country it had come from. An upright piano, dark wood, the kind that had sat in a parlor and been played on winter evenings and at celebrations and at the ordinary moments when someone simply felt like playing. The keys were intact. The wood was still sound. The brass hardware on the fallboard was still bright. It was not damaged. It was simply, catastrophically, too heavy. Tom stopped at the piano. He stood in front of it for a moment. Then he lifted the fallboard and pressed one key. The note that came out was not quite true. The humidity and the travel, having done something to the tuning that could not be corrected here. But it was a note, a real note, hanging in the dry mountain air for a moment before it faded. He stood there after it faded. Then he walked on. Clara had watched from the wagon. From her position near the front, where she could see through the canvas opening, she watched Tom press the key, and she heard the note, and she watched her brother stand there after the note was gone. She held the doll against her chest. She watched the piano until it was behind them. That evening she said to her mother, "Why did they leave the piano?" Margaret said, "Because it was too heavy." Clara said, "But someone carried it all this way." Margaret said, "Yes." Clara said, "So they thought they could bring it." Margaret said, "Yes, they thought they could." Clara looked at the doll in her hands. She said, "Will we have to leave things?" Margaret looked at her. She said, "We already did." In Missouri? Clara said more things. Margaret was quiet for a moment. She said, "I do not think so. I planned for what we needed." She paused. But the trail decides some things that planning does not reach. Clara looked at the doll. She said, "Not the doll. Margaret said, not the doll. Clara accepted this and lay down with the doll and looked at the canvas above her. The familiar light through the familiar cloth, thinner and more direct now than it had been on the plains. The air carrying less moisture. The sky a deeper blue at this altitude. She was not afraid. Her mother had said not the doll, and that was enough. On the 92nd day, James lifted the rear of the wagon to check the axle, and he and Margaret stood together afterward and looked at the load from the back and did the calculation one more time, with the mountains directly in their future and the animals thinner than they had been at Fort Laramie. The second blanket bundle. It had been a backup. 3 wool blankets rolled tight and oil-clothed, brought against the possibility of losing the primary bedding to water or fire. The primary bedding was intact. The backup had been intact for 92 days and had taken up space and weight for 92 days. James looked at it. Margaret looked at it. She said, 3 days easier on the animals going into the pass. He said yes. She said, if we lose the primary bedding between here and Oregon, we will manage. He said, how? She said, we will manage. He took the bundle out and set it beside the road. He stood looking at it for a moment. The moment that every person on this trail stood when they put something down that they had carried a long way. The full weight of the decision arriving in the body all at once. Then he walked away from it. Margaret did not look at it again. Tom made his mark that evening and then sat with his back against the wagon wheel and looked down the road they had come from. The road curved away behind them, and in the last of the light he could see, or thought he could see, the shapes of things left at the side of it, the darker masses against the pale ground, the accumulated evidence of 1,000 decisions that had seemed right until they did not. He thought about his mother in the barn in March, with her hand on the writing desk. He had watched from the barn door. He had not said anything, because even at 10, almost 11, he had understood that what he was watching was private, that it was the kind of thing a person needed to do without an audience. He had looked away then. He looked away now from the shapes beside the road. He went to the fire where his parents were sitting and sat down across from them and looked into the coals. His parents said nothing. They sat in the particular silence of people who have spent enough time together in hard circumstances that silence has stopped being empty and started being a thing with texture, a thing that holds what words would cost too much to say. Outside the circle of firelight, the night was coming down over the mountains ahead, their dark shapes against the last color in the western sky. The thing that James had been keeping in his peripheral vision for 2 weeks as it moved from abstraction to fact. Tomorrow, they would be in them. Tonight, the fire burned, and the family sat around it, and somewhere behind them down the long road, things they had carried this far sat at the side of the trail in the dark, still good, still whole, waiting for nothing, belonging now to the country they had been left in. There was no gate, no marker, no ceremony, no moment where the road changed its character and announced that you had arrived at the point everyone had been talking about since Missouri. South Pass came on the same way the rest of the trail came on, 1 foot in front of the other. The same gray morning light, and the same thin air, and the same oxen pulling the same load up a grade that had been increasing so gradually over so many miles that James had been climbing it for 2 days before he was certain he was climbing it. At 7,500 feet, the air was different. Not alarmingly different, thin enough to notice. Thin enough that the work of walking felt like slightly more work than the same walking had felt lower down. Thin enough that the lungs registered a small but constant reminder that the atmosphere here was not the atmosphere of Boone County or the Platte Valley. The pass itself was a broad saddle between ranges, wide enough that a wagon train could move through without compression, without rock walls closing in. It was open country at altitude, treeless, the grass low and sparse, the rock showing through in long outcroppings. The light was sharper up here, the shadows harder edged than they had been below. Webb brought the train through on the 98th day. He did not make an announcement about it. He rode to the front of the column and then back through it, and said to each wagon in turn, "We are through the pass," and moved on to the next one, with the flatness of a man delivering information that was factual and important and needed no embellishment. James heard it and looked around at the country they were in. He felt tired, not the daily tired of the trail, the tired that ended at the fire and resumed in the dark before 4, a different tired, a deeper layer that had been building since Missouri and that the crossing of the Continental Divide had not touched. He had expected something at South Pass, some shift in the quality of the effort or the feeling of the journey, some signal from his own body that a significant thing had happened. The body declined to signal. He was roughly 1,000 miles from where he had started. He had been walking for 98 days. At this point, at South Pass, in the Wind River Range, he was equidistant from both ends of the road. The miles behind equaled the miles ahead. He stood at the top of the pass in the thin, early morning air and looked west, and the land fell away from him in long, descending folds. A different country than what was behind him, drier and more austere, the color brown and ochre rather than the green-gray of the plains grass. Margaret came to stand beside him. She did not speak first. He said, "After a while, we are halfway." She said yes. A long, quiet. He said, "Does that feel like something to you?" She looked at the country falling away to the west. She said, "It feels like we cannot go back." He said, "We could not go back before this." She said, "No, but here it is a fact instead of a choice. The house is gone. The chest is in the barn. The blankets are by the road. There is no version of going back that goes back to anything." He looked at her. She was looking west, not at him, her face in the thin mountain light, with the quality of a face that has been outside for 98 days and has been shaped by that, the wind and the sun and the particular sharpening that sustained hard effort does to a person, removing whatever is not essential and leaving what is. She said, "We are going to get there." He said, "You do not know that." She said, "No, but I know the alternative is worse than trying, and knowing that is enough to keep going. That is all knowing needs to do at this point." She turned and walked back to the wagon. He stood for another minute at the top of the pass, with the wind moving through the saddle from the west, cold and direct, carrying the smell of different country. Then he walked. Tom was waiting by the wagon with his knife. He made his mark, the 98th notch in the row that now ran from near the front bracket to past the middle of the board. He pressed it in and ran his thumb along from the first mark to the last, the full length of it. He said, quietly halfway. Clara was sitting on the wagon tongue watching him. She said, "Is that what it is?" He said, "The miles we have come equal the miles we have to go." She thought about this. She said, "So we are in the middle." He said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the marks. She said, "The middle is the hardest place." He looked at her. She said, "Because you are too far to go back and not close enough to see the end. You just have to keep going, and there is nothing to hold on to except the going." He looked at the marks under his thumb. He said, "Yes, that is exactly what it is." She nodded as if this confirmed something she had been working out for some time. Then she lifted the doll and adjusted the blue dress, which had ridden up on one side, and settled it back with the careful attention she always brought to this small task, the tending of the thing she had carried this far and intended to carry the rest of the way. Daniel came by that afternoon. He came to the wagon not with the purposeful approach of a man who had something to say, but with the approach of a man who had decided to stop, which, in Daniel's economy of motion, was notable. He stood beside James for a moment, without speaking. Then he said, 98 days. James said yes. Daniel said, "I did not know if we would make it this far." James looked at him. Daniel said, "Not because of anything you did or did not do. I did not know if I would." He paused. "On the 42nd day I thought I had made an error about my own capacity for this." James said, "Why did you not say anything?" Daniel said, "Because saying it changes nothing about the road." He looked west, and then it passed. The 42nd day, and the 43rd, and I stopped thinking about turning back around the time Chimney Rock appeared. James said nothing. Daniel said, "I am still watching the calendar. I want to be clear." James said, "I know." Daniel said, "But I want you to know that what you said at the fire circle about the agreement." He stopped. James waited. Daniel said, "I have thought about it. About what kind of people we are becoming on this road." James said, "What have you decided?" Daniel said, "I have not decided." He looked at his brother. "Have you?" James thought about the flat with the circles in the grass, about Henderson stones on the plains, about the blanket bundle at the side of the road 2 days ago, about the piano with its one slightly false note in the dry air. He said, "I think it is making us more honest. Whether that is better or worse, I cannot say yet." Daniel stood with that for a moment. He said, "Ruth wants to have supper together tonight if Margaret is willing." James said, "I will ask her." That evening the two families built a single fire and ate together for the first time in several weeks. The 6 of them in the thin mountain air, with the last light going off the western ranges and the stars beginning in the east. The high, brilliant stars of altitude that seemed closer than the plain stars. More particular, Ruth and Margaret sat together with the children between them and talked about the practical things they always talked about. The food, the animals, what Webb had said that morning about the descent to the Green River and the water on the other side. James and Daniel sat across from them and were mostly quiet, which was fine. Sometimes the best thing two people with an unresolved argument between them could do was sit in the same place and share the same fire, and let the argument rest without surrendering it. Clara fell asleep against Ruth's side before the fire was half burned down. Ruth looked down at her, and then looked at Margaret. She said quietly, "She has done well." Margaret said yes. Ruth said, "All of them have." She was not talking only about the children. Margaret understood this, and said nothing and looked at the fire. The fire burned. The stars moved overhead in the slow rotation they had been making since before any of these people existed, and would continue making after all of them were gone. The same stars over Missouri, and the same stars over the Platte, and the same stars over South Pass, and over the Willamette Valley where they were going. Tom made his mark by firelight that evening, the last thing before sleep. Crouching at the sideboard with the knife in the orange glow, he pressed in the notch. He did not run his thumb along the route tonight. He stood up and looked west at the darkness over the descending country, and then went to his blankets under the wagon, where he lay on his back and looked at the bottom of the wagon bed above him. The middle required you to keep going. That was the whole of it. In the morning the oxen moved, and the wagons moved, and the road descended from the pass into the harder, drier country beyond it, and the family moved with it, as they had moved every day for 98 days, one foot in front of the other, forward, the only direction the road went. James noticed his hands on the 110th day. He had been looking at them without seeing them for weeks. The way you stop seeing the things that are always in front of you. On the 110th morning, he held them out over the fire while the water was heating, and looked at them the way he might look at a piece of equipment he was assessing for wear. The knuckles had cracked in the dry mountain air, and healed and cracked again. The cycle that cold, dry skin goes through when it is asked to do work every day without the relief of proper rest or proper fat or the ordinary domestic comfort of warm water and soap at the end of a day. The cracks were not deep enough to be dangerous. Not the kind that split open and bled when you gripped something. But they were present. A permanent map of the work drawn into the skin. In the mornings before the hands warmed, they were stiff in a way that required patience. A slow opening and closing while the fire built, working the joints back to something approaching full function before he touched the oxen or the harness, or anything that required a firm grip. He had stopped noticing this consciously somewhere around the 85th day. On the 110th day he noticed it again. He looked at his hands and thought, these are the hands of a man who has been on this road a long time. Then he put them to work. Margaret's feet were worse than she had let on. She had managed the blister situation through the summer with the systematic attention she brought to all problems within her reach. The cloth wrapping, and the careful shoe management, and the slight adjustments of gait that distributed the wear more evenly across the foot. She had kept it from becoming a crisis. Keeping something from becoming a crisis was not the same as solving it. And by the 110th day, the soles of both shoes were worn in ways that no amount of careful management could conceal from someone paying attention. James was paying attention. He saw it in the way she walked in the late afternoon, the small compensations that appeared after the 12th or 13th mile, the slight favoring of the right side that she probably did not know was visible. He said nothing directly. He got out the piece of buffalo hide he had traded for east of Fort Laramie and cut 2 pieces from it, roughly the shape and size of inner soles, and left them on top of her shoes that evening without comment. She found them in the morning. She looked at them for a moment. She fitted them inside the shoes and put them on and walked the morning miles and said nothing about it until evening. Then she said, "That helped." He said, "Good." That was the whole of it. Tom was taller. Not dramatically. Not in the way growth spurts announce themselves, but in the way that 3.5 months of sustained physical work and outdoor living do to an 11-year-old boy. A lengthening that had happened so gradually, no one had remarked on it until Margaret noticed one morning in the 2nd week after South Pass that his trouser cuffs were 2 inches above his boot tops. She let them out as far as the hem would allow. When she handed them back, she said, "You have grown this summer." He looked at the trousers. He said, "Have I?" She said, "Yes." "You have?" He considered this with the expression of a boy receiving information about himself that he had not expected. He said, "Is that all right?" She said, "It is very all right." Clara had grown too. In the less visible way younger children grow, filling out rather than lengthening. The baby softness of her face, resolving into something slightly more defined. She was browner than she had been in Missouri, the sun having done its patient work through the summer months, and her hands were rougher. The hands of a child who had been doing small outdoor tasks every day for months, and whose skin had adapted to it. The doll's blue dress was faded now to a color between blue and gray, the color of something that had been blue for a long time, and been asked to hold it through more than color could reasonably be asked to hold. Clara did not seem to notice the change. The doll was the doll. It had come this far, and it was going the rest of the way. The oxen were what James watched most carefully. He had been watching them all summer the way a man watches the single most important thing in his operation, which they were. Without them, there was no wagon, and without the wagon, there was nothing. And this was not an abstraction. It was the physical fact that every family on the trail understood in whatever part of the mind held the things that could not be looked at directly but had to be held in peripheral awareness at all times. They were thinner. The ribs showed in the low afternoon light when the sun was at the right angle. He did not look at this directly, because looking at it directly was not useful. But he registered it the same way Margaret registered the state of the flour barrel, as information to be carried and accounted for in every decision that followed. He had 4 oxen. He had started with 4, and still had 4, which put him in a better position than several families in the train who had lost animals to bad water and injury and the accumulated strain of the miles. Daniel still had 4 as well. Henderson's wagon, driven now by Avery, was down to 3 after 1 animal gave out on the approach to South Pass. Those 3 were pulling a lighter load because the sorting that had happened at the roadside over the previous weeks had taken weight off every wagon in the train. Each morning James checked them. He ran his hands along their backs and their shoulders, feeling for the heat of injury, checking the yoke points where the skin wore most readily, looking at their legs from the knees down. He did this in 10 minutes, and then stood back and read the way they stood, whether they were square on their feet or favoring aside, whether their heads were up or carried lower than they should be. On the 108th day he found heat in the left shoulder of the led ox, the same animal that had been borderline since the last river crossing. He treated it with grease and wrapping and shifted the yoke load as much as the configuration allowed and reduced the afternoon miles by 2 for 3 days running. This cost time, Daniel noticed. James explained simply and without apology. The animal needs 3 easier days or we lose it before the mountains. Daniel said nothing. The animal came through. The 3 days were gone and they could not be recovered. And Daniel knew they could not be recovered. And James knew Daniel knew. And the knowledge sat between them without becoming an argument, which was its own kind of progress. On the 110th evening, after supper, Daniel came to James's fire and sat down. He looked at the fire for a while without speaking. Then he said, "I want to say something and I want you to hear it without answering right away." James said, "All right." Daniel said, I have been running the calendar every day since Missouri. You know this. I have not stopped, and I am not going to stop, because the calendar is real, and the mountains are real, and the cost of being wrong about the timing is real. He paused. He said, but I have also been watching you. The water, the oxen, the way you read the ground. He stopped again. He said, you see things I do not see. James said nothing. Daniel said, I think we see different parts of the same road, and I think we need both parts to get through what is ahead. He stood up. He said, I am going to need you to trust my calendar in the blues. When I say we have to move, we have to move. James looked at him. He said, and what do I need from you? Daniel said, what do you need? James said, I need you to trust that when I say the animals need a day, they need a day. The animals are the road. Without them, we do not have a calendar problem. We have a different kind of problem. Daniel stood with that. He said, all right. James said, all right. Neither of them said anything else. Daniel went back to his wagon, and James sat at his fire and looked into the coals, and Margaret sat across from him and said nothing, because what had just happened between the two brothers was the closest thing to a settlement that two people with genuinely different ways of reading the same problem were likely to arrive at. Not agreement. Accommodation. Its own hard-won thing. She poured the last of the evening coffee into his cup. He held it in his cracked hands and felt the warmth move in from both sides. The mountains were ahead of them now, in a way they had not been before. Not the abstraction of mountains on a map or in a guidebook, but the specific physical fact of them. The dark shapes of the blue mountains that Webb had pointed to on the 105th day and said, that is where we are going. James had looked at them every day since. They did not look like something that would ask nothing of a person. They looked like what they were. The blues came up fast. That was what caught people who had been watching them grow on the horizon for a week, who thought they understood the scale of them because they had been watching. The watching did not prepare you for the actual approach. The foothills rose and the canyon walls came in, and the grades steepened and the trees, the first real trees since the Missouri Valley, closed over the road, and suddenly the country that had been open and horizontal and readable for 600 miles was vertical and dark and close. The trees were enormous, ponderosa and fierce. Some of them straight-trunked and clear-limbed 100 feet up, the kind of trees that made a man from the cut-over country of Missouri stand still and look up and feel both small and something other than small. Some version of recognition, standing inside something that had been growing for longer than he had been alive. Tom stood in the road and looked up. He stood long enough that the wagon caught up to him, and Margaret called from beside it, and he walked on. But he kept looking up at the tree crowns as he walked, the way the light came down through them in shafts that moved as the wind moved the upper branches, the way the forest floor was dim and cool and smelled of something entirely different from everything he had been smelling for 4 months. Resin, damp earth, the particular clean darkness of old forest. Clara smelled it from inside the wagon. She lifted the canvas at the front and looked out and breathed it in and said, to no one in particular, it smells like something new. The grade was the first problem, not the climbing, which was hard but manageable. The oxen pulling the long, steady grades with the patience they brought to everything asked of them. The descents were the problem. the steep pitches where the road went down, at angles that put the full weight of the loaded wagon against the animal's haunches, where an uncontrolled descent meant the wagon pushing the oxen off their feet and everything coming down together in a pile of wood and iron and ruined goods. For the steepest sections they used ropes. Loop a heavy rope around a tree near the crest of the slope and run it back to the rear axle of the wagon. Then let the wagon down slowly, hand over hand, the rope taking the strain, while the oxen managed only their own footing. It worked if the tree was right and the rope was sound and the men on it were steady. It worked most of the time. On the 129th day, Garrett's wagon came down the third pitch too fast when a knot slipped on the rope. The wagon swung left and caught a boulder with the rear left wheel, and the wheel came off, and the wagon tilted, and most of what was in it shifted to the low side, and the whole thing stopped against a tree 40 feet down the slope at an angle no wagon was meant to hold. Nobody was hurt. The wheel was broken. It took 4 hours and the work of 12 men to get the wagon back to the road and make the repair with the spare materials Garrett had been carrying for exactly this situation. Without spares, a broken wheel in the Blue Mountains was not a 4-hour problem. Daniel was one of the 12 men. He worked on the wheel without being asked. The same way the camp had stopped without being asked. When the Callaway wheel needed attention on the 23rd day, he worked and said nothing about the hours lost. And James worked beside him and said nothing about that either. Some things did not need saying. Clara got sick on the 131st day. Not suddenly, quietly, the way things came on the trail, through a sequence of small signs that accumulated into a fact. She was quieter than usual at breakfast. She did not finish her biscuit. She sat in the wagon rather than walking beside it through the morning, which was a statement from a child who preferred walking. By midday, Margaret knew. She climbed into the wagon at the noon stop and put her hand on Clara's forehead and felt what she expected. The particular warmth of a fever not yet high enough to be alarming but present and established and intending to stay. She said nothing to James at the noon stop. She said it that evening when the camp was settled and the children were in the wagon, and Daniel and Ruth were at their own fire 50 yards away. She said, "Clara has a fever." James looked at her. She said, "It is not high. She is drinking. She is alert. But she has a fever, and she will need to be in the wagon tomorrow and possibly the day after." He said, "How long?" She said, "I do not know. A few days, maybe more." She paused. "Children get fevers. Children get fevers on the trail. I am watching her, and I will keep watching her." He got up and went to the wagon. Clara was lying on the bedding with the doll against her chest. In the lantern light, her face had the quality fever gives a child's face. Slightly softened and inward, the eyes not quite as bright as usual, but present. Tracking him when he came through the canvas opening. He crouched beside her. He said, "How do you feel?" She said, "Hot." He said, "I know. Mama is taking care of it." She said, "I know she is." He looked at her for a moment. She said, "Papa." He said, "Yes." She said, "Are we close?" He thought about how to answer this honestly without giving her a number that would make the distance feel impossible. He said, "Close enough that I can say we are going to make it." She looked at him. She said, "You have not said that before." He said, "No, I have not." She thought about this. She said, "All right." She closed her eyes. He stayed crouched beside her after she was asleep, watching her breathe. The small, regular rise and fall of it, the doll held against her chest with both hands. The faded blue-gray dress that had been bright in Missouri, and was this color now. The color of something the trail had made. He listened to her breathe. He stayed a long time. Margaret came in and found him there, and sat on the other side of Clara without speaking, and they sat together in the lantern light, on opposite sides of their sleeping daughter, and did not need to say what they were both doing there. 3 nights? James slept beside the wagon for 3 nights, rather than under it, close enough to the canvas that he could hear if something changed inside. He did not sleep deeply. He lay in his blankets and listened to the forest sounds and the camp sounds, and underneath both of them, the small, steady rhythm of his daughter breathing. He counted the breaths, not because they needed counting, but because counting them was the only useful thing he could do from where he was. Margaret was inside with Clara for all 3 nights. She slept in the intervals between checks, the half-hour stretches of shallow sleep that were not rest exactly, but were what was available. On the 2nd night, James lay outside and listened to the mountains. The blue mountains at night were not silent. The wind moved through the upper forest in a sound like water over stone, continuous and without rhythm, and beneath it the smaller sounds of the dark forest. The things that lived here and moved through this country that was not his country and did not require his approval. He lay and listened. He thought about what he had said to Daniel weeks ago. The calendar is a tool for getting the family through. It is not the family's master. He lay with this in the dark forest. He still believed it. He still believed it with his daughter in the wagon, which was the test of whether you believed a thing or only believed it when the cost was low. On the morning of the 4th day, Clara's fever broke. Gradually, the way recovery actually happens. The temperature coming down through the morning in slow increments that Margaret tracked with her hand on Clara's forehead at intervals, until by early afternoon she was certain. She came out of the wagon and found James at the fire. She said, "It is down." He looked at her. She said she ate something. "She is keeping it." He set down the cup he was holding. He went to the wagon and looked in. Clara was sitting up with the doll in her lap, not lying down anymore, sitting up with the particular upright quality of a person whose body has come back to them after being away for a while. She looked at him, and he looked at her. She said, "I am hungry." He said, "I know. Mama will fix something." She said, "Can I walk tomorrow?" He said, "We will see how you feel in the morning." She said, "I want to walk. I have been in here too long." He said, "Yes, I know." He let the canvas down and stood at the back of the wagon for a moment. Then he went to find Daniel. Daniel was at his wagon checking his oxen. The same morning routine, James ran at his own wagon. James said, "Clara's fever broke." Daniel looked up. He said, "Good." He said it simply and meant it simply. The plain human relief of a man hearing his niece was no longer sick. James said, "We can move tomorrow." Daniel looked at him. James said, "If the animals are ready." Daniel said, "They are ready. They have been ready." James said, "I know. Thank you for waiting." Daniel looked back at the oxen. He said, "We are brothers on the same road." He paused. "I was not going to leave you in the blues." James said nothing. Daniel said, "But we do need to move." James said, "Yes." Daniel said, "Tomorrow." James said, "Tomorrow." That evening, Tom made 4 marks on the sideboard. one for each day Clara had been sick. The days he had not made the marks, because in those days the making of them had seemed beside the point, a small, ordinary ritual that did not fit the weight of what those days had actually been. He made them now. He pressed each one in carefully, 4 notches close together, and then ran his thumb along the whole row from the first mark to the last. 134 marks. He stood at the wagon with his thumb on the last mark and looked at the forest around the camp. The big dark trees with the stars beginning between them in the gaps where the canopy opened. The mountain air cold enough now that his breath showed faintly in the lantern light. 134 days. He thought about the first mark, the 8th morning, sitting on the wagon tongue in the gray Missouri light, with no idea what the row would become or how long it would need to be. He thought about the mark after Henderson died, the marks after the blanket bundle at the roadside, the mark at South Pass. He thought about the 4 marks he had just made for the days Clara was sick. He thought about Clara saying, "I think we are the home part." He looked at the forest. He looked at the wagon. He went inside and lay down beside his sister, who was sleeping with the doll against her chest, her breathing even and regular. And he lay in the dark and listened to it for a while, because listening to it was the right thing to do in that moment, in that wagon, in that forest. At that particular point, in the 134 days it had taken to get here, in the morning, before anyone was up, he went to the oxen. He did not know exactly why. He found himself there in the pre-dawn dark, standing beside the led animal, the way his father stood. The quiet standing close to the animal before the camp woke. The ox turned its head and looked at him. He put his hand on the animal's neck, the way his father put his hand on things to confirm they were there and they were all right. The ox was warm. James found him there when he came out to start the morning routine. He stopped. He looked at his son standing with his hand on the ox's neck in the pre-dawn dark of the Blue Mountains. 134 days from Missouri. He did not say anything. He went to the other animals and began the morning check, working quietly in the dark beside his son, who was doing the same thing without having been asked, doing it because the trail had made it something he knew to do, because 11-year-olds on the Oregon Trail learned things that 11-year-olds in Missouri parlors did not need to know, because the road had been building this boy for 4.5 months out of the materials it had available, which were difficulty and distance and the daily example of people doing what needed doing without performance or complaint. The sky began to lighten in the east. The camp began to stir. The oxen moved. All of them. The rain started on the 143rd day. Not the rain of the plains, the hard, brief storms that came from the southwest in the afternoon and were finished before supper. This was Oregon rain. A different kind entirely. The kind that had been traveling from the Pacific for a long time before it arrived and intended to stay. It came in low and gray and settled over the country the way a ceiling settled, without drama, without announcement, simply present in a way that made the dry months behind them feel like something from a different life. The trail to the Willamette Valley ran through it. The ground, which had been the brown hardpack of the late-season eastern Oregon plateau, changed under the rain into something softer and more variable, the surface holding the wagon wheels longer before releasing them, and then releasing them suddenly into a deeper layer that required the oxen to pull harder, and the men to put their shoulders to the spokes on the bad sections. James put his shoulder to the spokes for the first time on the 144th day. He had done it before on the trail, on bad crossings and soft ground. But this was different. This was not a crossing that would end and return to solid road. This was the road. This was what the road was now and what it would be for the remaining days. The mud and the rain and the big trees and the sky low enough to feel like something you were walking inside. He pushed, and the wagon moved, and the oxen found their footing, and the wheel came out of the deep place, and the wagon rolled forward onto slightly firmer ground. He stood in the rain for a moment, breathing. Then he walked on. Clara was in the wagon. Not because she was sick again, but because the rain was coming through the canvas in places where the cloth had worn thin. The slow seepage of water through fabric that had been stressed by 5 months of sun and wind and loading and unloading. Margaret had put Clara in the driest part with the oilcloth over her and told her to stay there. And Clara was staying there, watching the water find its way through the canvas in thin, dark lines and drip from the bows to the load below. She watched the drips with the same attention she had brought to everything on this trail. The rain sounded different on the canvas now than it had in May. In Missouri and on the early plains, the canvas had been tight and the rain had hit it with a clean, sharp sound. Each drop distinct. Now the canvas had given slightly, absorbed some weight of the journey in its weave, and the rain against it made a softer and more continuous sound, less like drops and more like water on leaves. The sound of something that had been through enough to have changed how it received the world. She lay under the oilcloth and listened to it. She thought, "This is Oregon." She had been thinking about Oregon since before Missouri, since the winter evenings, when her father read from the letters and her mother sat with her mending, and the word Oregon had been said so many times, it had become something more than a word. A direction, a place the family was going toward. She had constructed it in her imagination from the fragments the letters provided. Good land and long seasons and rain that came reliably, and it had been a bright imagined place through all the months of the trail. The thing at the end of the road that made the road worth being on. Oregon was water coming through the canvas. Oregon was mud against the wheels, and her father's shoulder against a spoke, and her mother walking in the rain with her skirt soaked to the knee. Oregon was real. She looked at the doll. The blue dress was gray blue now, the gray of something that had been blue for a long time and had been asked to hold the color through more than color could be asked to hold. She straightened the dress. She held the doll against her chest. She listened to the rain. The train came out of the mountains and into the approaches of the Willamette Valley on the 146th day. It did not come out all at once. The valley revealed itself in stages, through gaps in the trees, and then along a ridge line from which the land fell away to the west in long descending slopes, and then finally at a clearing where the full view opened, and what was below them was the valley. Webb stopped the train at the clearing. He did not make a speech. He simply stopped and let the people look, because looking was what was required here, the thing the months of walking had earned, and it did not need words around it. The valley lay below them in the rain, green. In a way, nothing on the trail had been green. the deep, saturated green of country that received abundant rain on fertile soil. A green that was almost startling after the brown and ochre of the eastern sections, after the dry mountain country, after the months of dust. The Willamette River ran through the middle of it, present now and actual, and below them, James stood at the edge of the clearing. He looked at it for a long time. He did not feel what he had expected to feel. He had thought, in the abstract way, you think about things far enough away to be imaginary, that arriving within sight of the valley would produce something large and definitive, some internal completion that matched the external fact of having crossed a continent. He had not known what it would feel like, but he had assumed it would feel like something identifiable. He felt tired, not the tired of a single hard day, the tired that lives underneath every day for months, the tired that does not lift with sleep, because sleep on the trail is not the sleep that repairs that kind of tired. The tired that had been accumulating since Missouri, and that the sight of the valley, green and real and below him, had not lifted and would not lift today. He also felt something else, something without an exact name, the feeling of a thing that had been in the future for so long that the present tense of it was not yet fully real. The feeling of standing at the edge of the thing you have been moving toward for 146 days, and finding that the gap between the imagined and the actual was larger than expected in both directions at once. The valley was real. The valley was more than he had imagined in some ways. The size of it, the depth of the green, the quality of the light through the rain. The valley was also less, in the way all arrivals are less than the departures that preceded them, because departures happen in the future tense and arrivals happen in the present, and the present is always more complicated than the future. Margaret came to stand beside him. She looked at the valley for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "We need to find our land before the ground gets worse." He said yes. She said, Webb said, "There are people below who can direct us to the claim areas." He said yes. She said, "James?" He looked at her. She said, "Look at it." He said, "I am." She said, "Really look at it." He looked at the green of it, and the river through it, and the rain coming down over it, and the mountains behind them, that they had come through, and the road descending ahead into it. He said, "It is real." She said, "Yes, it is." She took his hand. They stood at the edge of the clearing for another moment. Then Margaret said, "All right." And they walked down. The formal machinery of land allocation had not yet been established in 1846 the way it would later be established. What existed was a system of informal prior claim, the practice of marking and occupying land and registering the claim with the provisional government the settlers themselves had organized. Imperfect and sometimes disputed, it functioned as the only system available. James found his claim on the second day in the valley, not the first land he looked at. He spent the better part of a day walking the available ground with a man named Forsyth, who had been in the valley since '43 and knew which sections drained well and which held water through the winter and which had soil deep enough to farm without amendment. He looked at a third section. James crouched and picked up a handful of soil and held it and let it fall through his fingers. He looked at the tree line at the south edge, and the direction the light came from, and the way the ground lay, the slight grade that would drain it without drying it. He stood up. He said, "This one." Forsyth said, good ground. James said yes. He stood in the rain on the land that was going to be his, and looked at it the way he had looked at land in Missouri for 11 years. Reading it the way you read something you are going to be in a relationship with for a long time. The land was quiet in the rain. It waited, the way land waits, for whatever would be asked of it. The cabin came first, not the cabin they would eventually build. The first structure was a log shelter, rough and low, built from the timber they felled, clearing the south field, built to be standing before the weather made sleeping in the wagon untenable, which was a deadline measured in weeks. James and Daniel built it together. They had staked adjacent claims, not by arrangement, but by the separate logic of two men who had been traveling together for 5 months and who found, when they walked the available ground independently, that they had arrived at adjoining parcels, which seemed right, which seemed like the kind of outcome that 5 months of shared road produces without anyone deciding it. They felled the timber and notched the logs and raised the walls in 4 days. It was not a good cabin. It was a shelter with walls and a roof and a fireplace James built from the flat stones he pulled from the creek at the east edge of the claim. The fireplace smoked in the wrong wind direction and drew reasonably well in every other. The floor was packed earth. The single window was covered with oiled paper because there was no glass, and glass was months away. Margaret stood in it on the 5th day and looked around. She stood in the center of the single room and turned slowly, the way she had turned in the kitchen in Missouri in February, when she was measuring the wagon with a piece of string, measuring what was possible against what was needed. She stopped turning. She said, "It will do." James said, "It is not what it will be." She said, "No, but it is what it is, and it will do." She put the iron pot on the fireplace crane and swung it over the fire she had built in the new hearth. The first fire in this place. The first of the fires that would burn here through the winter and beyond. And the sound of the pot on the crane, iron on iron, filled the room. The way sound fills a small room with close walls, completely, leaving no corners untouched. Clara came in from outside. She was wet from the rain. She stood in the doorway and looked at the room, at the walls and the packed earth floor and the smoking fireplace and the oiled paper window with the Oregon rain making its sound against it. Then she set the doll on the floor beside the wall, sitting up, facing the room. She said she has been waiting to have a place to sit. Margaret looked at the doll sitting against the wall with its faded gray-blue dress and its face with one eye slightly less dark than the other, looking out at the room that was going to be their room, in the country that was going to be their country, at the end of the road that had brought all of them here. She said yes. I suppose she has. The rain came down outside on the raw new country of the Callaway claim, on the felled timber waiting to be split, on the turned earth of the first clearing, on the wagon standing at the edge of the trees with its canvas darkened by the wet. The canvas that had been white in Missouri and was this color now. The color of a thing that had been through everything it had been through and arrived. Tom was outside with his father and his uncle, splitting wood for the fireplace stack. He swung the axe with the swing of a boy who had been doing this since June, the particular efficient motion of someone who learned from repetition rather than instruction, who had the swing in the body before the body was fully grown into it. He split a piece and set it aside and split another. The rain came down. He worked. The canvas came off in March. James took it down in sections over 2 days. The sections still sound going into storage in the shelter, at the back of the claim, where they would serve as covers and tarps and patches for other things. The sections no longer sound. The places where the weave had opened and the waterproofing had failed and the cloth had gone thin enough to see light through. Those went on to the fire, in the small controlled burn he did at the edge of the first cleared field. The field that had been stumps in October and was ready to plant now in the long Oregon spring. The wagon frame stood without the canvas. It stood through February, while James decided what to do with the frame itself. Whether to rebuild it as a work wagon for the farm, whether to salvage the iron and the seasoned wood for other purposes, whether there was any useful life left in the running gear. After 147 days of trail, there was. The wheels were sound. The axles, reinforced at Fort Laramie, had held. The tongue was solid. The sideboards were worn but structural. It was not the wagon it had been in Missouri. Not the white canvas thing that had stood in the yard in Boone County on the last day of April the year before. But it was still a wagon, still a working thing, still capable of doing what wagons did. James was going to need it. There was land to work and timber to haul and the 1,000 tasks of a new farm in new country that required something to carry things from one place to another. And the wagon had been built for exactly that. And it had been doing exactly that for longer and harder than it had ever been asked to do it. And there was no reason to stop asking. He oiled the axles on a morning in early March, and checked the wheel rims, and tightened the hardware, and stood back and looked at it. The bare frame of it, in the morning light, without the canvas. Smaller than it had appeared on the trail. Or perhaps exactly the same size it had always been. Just visible now, in a way it had not been when the canvas covered it and gave it the shape of something larger than its bones. Tom was there. He had come out to help with the oiling and had done his section of the work and was standing at the side of the wagon running his hand along the inside of the starboard board. The board that faced him when he crouched to make the marks. The board where the row ran from near the front bracket to the middle and then beyond it. 147 marks. He had made the last one on the day they came down into the valley, standing in the rain at the edge of the clearing where Webb had stopped the train, pressing the knife into the wet wood with the valley below, and the 147th day of the journey ending the way all the days had ended, with the mark and the thumb along the row, and the count that was not always a count, but was always a reckoning. He ran his thumb along them now, from the first, the 8th morning in Missouri, small and slightly uncertain, the mark of a boy who had not made this kind of mark before, and was not sure what it would become, to the last, the 147th, deeper and cleaner than the first. The mark of someone who had been doing this long enough that the hand knew what it was doing without being told. He ran his thumb from one end to the other. He did not count them. He had counted once, in February, on a quiet afternoon when the rain was down, and he had gone out to the wagon for no particular reason, and found himself at the sideboard and counted. 147. He had stood there with the number and let it settle into whatever place numbers go when they stop being calculations and become something else. When they stop being information and start being the shape of a thing that happened, he did not need to count again. He knew the number, the way he knew the distances, now. Not as information, but as something carried in the body. Something that had become part of how he understood the difference between one place and another. Between one version of himself and another. Clara came out of the cabin. She was carrying the doll. She came to the wagon and stood beside Tom and looked at the sideboard the way she looked at things. Directly and with full attention. She said, "How many?" He said, 147. She looked at the marks. She said, "That is a lot of days." He said, "Yes." She said, "Do you think you will make more somewhere else?" He thought about this. He said, "I do not know. Maybe. If something seems worth counting." She nodded. She adjusted the doll's dress. The gray-blue dress that had been bright blue in Missouri, and was this color now? The color of everything that had been on the trail long enough to be changed by it. She said, "The doll needs a new dress." He said, "Mama will make one." She said, "I know, but I do not think I want her to right away." He said, "Why?" She said, "Because this dress came all the way." She looked at it. She said, "I do not want to cover that up yet." He looked at the dress. He said, "All right." She went back inside. Tom stood at the wagon for a while longer. The Oregon morning was doing what Oregon mornings did in March. The light coming in low and clean through a break in the clouds to the east. The particular quality of Pacific Northwest light that was different from Missouri light. Softer and more diffuse. Without the hard shadows of the plains noon. Light that seemed to come from everywhere slightly, rather than from one specific direction. The first field was ready to plant. His father was out there now, turning the last of the soil at the south end. The oxen working the ground in the methodical back and forth that James had been teaching himself and Tom since November. When the first clearing was finished, and the first ground had been turned, and the farm had stopped being a plan and started being a thing with soil in it, the oxen moved through the field in the morning light. Not pulling a wagon, pulling a plow, which was different. Slower and more lateral. Back and forth across the face of the earth, rather than straight through it toward a fixed point on the horizon. They moved with the same patience they had always moved with. The patience that had gotten them from Missouri to here. The patience that did not distinguish between one kind of work and another, but brought itself fully to whatever was in front of it. Tom watched them work. He thought about what his mother had said at the clearing above the valley. Really look at it. He thought about what his father had said to Daniel at South Pass. I think it is making us more honest. He thought about the 147 days and what they contained. Henderson stones on the plains, and the piano in the mountain air, and the circles in the grass, and Clara's fever in the Blue Mountains, and the flat that had been emptied before any of them arrived, and the blanket bundle at the brass side of the road, and the rocking chair in the morning light, and Daniel at the fire in the blues saying, "We are brothers on the same road." He thought about Clara saying, "I think we are the home part." He stood at the wagon, and the morning came in around him. The Oregon morning with its particular light, and its smell of turned earth, and its sound of the oxen working the field, and the distant sound of Daniel's axe from the claim next door, and the smell of Margaret's fire in the cabin. Behind him, he was 12 years old. He had come 147 days from the boy who had lain on his back in Missouri, looking at the ceiling of a room that was about to stop being his room. And he was not finished, becoming whatever he was becoming. Not close to finished. But the trail had done something to the becoming that nothing else could have done. Had pushed it faster and harder, and in directions that comfort does not push a person, and whatever came next would be built on what the 147 days had made. He put his hand on the sideboard one last time. He felt the marks under his palm, the full length of them, the row that had begun in Missouri and ended in Oregon, and that held between its first notch and its last, the whole of the distance between those two places, measured not in miles, but in days. In the only unit that actually mattered, when you were living inside a thing instead of looking at it from the outside. Then he took his hand away. He went to help his father. Inside the cabin, Margaret was at the fire, the iron pot swinging over the heat on the crane James had built into the new hearth. The same motion she had made 10,000 times in Missouri and on the trail, and now here. The motion of a woman tending the thing that kept a family fed and warm. The motion that was not small, because nothing that keeps people alive is small. She stirred the pot. She listened to the rain beginning again on the cabin roof. The Oregon rain coming back the way it always came back. Patient and regular and indifferent to whether you were ready for it. She listened to Tom's footsteps crossing the yard to the field. She listened to the oxen. She listened to the fire. She put her hand on the pot handle and felt the heat of it through the folded cloth, and thought about the morning in Missouri when she had stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the empty room with the pale rectangles on the wall where the pictures had been, and thought about the fire she had not put out. That fire was long out now. This fire was new. She stirred the pot. The morning came in through the oiled paper window. The pale Oregon light through the paper. That was the same paper she had hung over the opening in October, when the cabin was new and the rain was starting. The light becoming familiar, the way the light in Missouri had been familiar, through the daily accumulation of mornings seen through the same window. It would take time. A new country takes time. A new field takes time. A new cabin takes time to stop being new and start being simply the place you live, whose particular smell and light and sound become the smell and light and sound of ordinary life, rather than the smell and light and sound of a place you have recently arrived. She knew this. She had known it since before they left. In the part of herself that planned without sentiment, that saw what was coming and accounted for it before it arrived. What she had not known, what could not have been in any calculation she made in Missouri, was the particular quality of standing here, in this cabin, in this rain, with this fire, on this land. What it would actually feel like. She had crossed a continent to find out. Outside, the wagon stood in the Oregon rain without its canvas, the bare frame of it in the morning light, the wood darkened by the wet, the wheels on the ground they had arrived at after 147 days of other ground. It had carried the flour and the bacon and the tools and the medicine and the bedding and the seed and the oilcloth and the needles and the small bundle of letters and locks of hair and a piece of blue silk that Margaret kept in the inside pocket of her coat, not because she had room for it, but because some things are not about room. It had carried what a family needed to survive. It had carried what they became. The rain came down on it. The field opened ahead of it. The oxen moved through the morning. It had done what it was built to do,